Cool. So yeah, I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay. Actually, maybe this will be the start. We'll see. But I was curious, how did you decide to do a research project on COVID-19? I mean, in some sense, it seems like there's a very obvious reason for how you got exposed to the topic. But you didn't, you're not an epidemiologist or someone who studies anything related to this. So what was your, you and in the lab, how did that whole thing start?
Yeah. So I guess the main point of interest for me is, because I do research on anxiety and fear, and essentially the entire population has been exposed to what we consider quite an unpleasant experience, which is likely to lead to anxiety and fear. So that was why I was interested in doing it. Because, it might tell us some things about why we become anxious, and B, there may be kind of mental health effects. It's not the primary thing we're looking at, but we may be able to get some insight into how, the pandemic has affected people's mental health. So the story of how we did this, basically I'm working with Dean Mobbs at Caltech on this, and it was it March, the second week of March, when we kind of realized that things were getting pretty serious. And I kind of was chatting to my partner, who's also an academic, and we kind of got talking about this and thought, actually maybe this is something we should be studying. It's a rare thing that occurs to humanity, a pandemic on this scale, and we thought it might be important to study it. So I sent Dean an email quickly. He was like, yeah, sure, let's chat tomorrow. Went into the office on Monday. We decided, yeah, okay, let's go for it. We managed to get ethical approval on the Tuesday, and thanks to Caltech's very efficient IRB. And then on Wednesday, we were able to collect our first lot of data. So yeah, it's a very rapid process going from this initial idea of wanting to look at anxiety in response to the pandemic and actually doing the thing.
Was the first thing you recorded, was the first data you collected, was that what's in your Royal Society Open Science paper, or what did you record there?
Yeah, so that is the data in there. So we did, so on that week, I can't remember what the first date was. I think the first day may have been the 11th of March.
I've got the paper right here. You give me a second.
I should really have it up as well.
But
was it the 11th or the 13th?
11th, yes. 11th.
Yeah, okay. So that was the Wednesday, I think. So yeah, we got that first lot of data in, I think, 500 subjects, or thereabouts. And then we thought, we may as well kind of keep collecting data for the next week or so, which we did. So we did, I think, we did sort of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, different lots of people. Then we went back and followed the first 500 we did on the Wednesday on, I think, the following Monday or Tuesday. But that whole week of data basically is in that paper. So the idea is we wanted to kind of show how people's kind of perception of risk and things like that changed over that very first week, because that was where it was on that Wednesday that the WHO declared it a pandemic, a global pandemic.
The 11th, or which?
I think it was on the 11th that the World Health Organization actually said, this is a global pandemic. And during that week, politicians all around the world, including in the United States, started to make some kind of movement towards wanting to control it a bit more. So that was it's basically the first kind of week where people thought, okay, this is serious, at least in the United States.
Was the motivation then from the start to? Was it primarily to study, was the prime thing to study the pandemic, or was it more to use the pandemic as the phrase I think is natural experiment, or what people might call it, where you have these changes in people's, what they're exposed to, their behavior, whatever. From which direction did you come, or was it just a blend of everything?
It was definitely the latter. So it was more using it as a natural experiment. Obviously, we don't want to kind of just kind of make it sound like we're taking advantage of people's suffering or anything like that. It's obviously an awful thing that's happened, but you may as well make the best of a bad situation. It's this kind of a stressful life event on this kind of scale which is experienced by this many people, is not the sort of thing you can do in the lab ever. Like, I mean, you would not, A, you would want to, B, the IOB would probably never approve it. So if we want to understand how people react to these kind of like really, really stressful, serious life events, the only way to do it is naturalistically. So you have to kind of, do what you can when they happen. One other example of this is where people have looked at, for example, kind of PTSD and things in response to terrorist attacks. So 9/11, for example. That's the sort of thing if you want to understand how those kind of responses to traumatic events develop, you can't do that in the lab. So you just have to kind of latch on to something bad that happens to occur in real life. It's very much, this is a terrible thing that's happening. What can we try and learn from it, essentially?
Yeah. So what can we learn from it?
That's a good question.
In your particular case, maybe.
I mean, to be honest, we went into it, given how rushed it was, we went into it with quite vague kind of expectations and ideas. So in the paper that we published on it, to be honest, that was not the data we're describing there. That wasn't part of a primary hypothesis or anything. It's more just like, we have this data on how risk perception is changing early on. We may as well put it out there so people can see it and use it. What we're more interested in is how specifically people's risk perception and their anxiety develops as the pandemic goes on for months, basically. So we've been following people up since March to look at that. Because
at what intervals?
So we've been doing it. We started off quite densely sampling. We're doing it, I think, every 2 weeks. Then we kind of dropped out to sort of a month. Now we're doing it every couple of months. And I think we're just doing our final one this week. But the reason behind that is basically a lot of the work that I do, in particular in the lab, looks at how people learn about threat and how they feel subjectively in response to that threat that they're learning about. So I kind of wanted to then essentially translate that to the real world and say, we have this external stressor that people are being experienced to. How do people learn about the risks that they face from that stressor, and how do they respond to it subjectively as time goes on? So that was kind of the main thing that we wanted to test.
So one thing that we found also interesting in our study that we found difficult to think about is that you often just don't know what the actual risk is, right? As a scientist, even. It's not that you have some tightly controlled experiment and you can say the risk is 80%. So how do you think that affects people? Not just this, complete uncertainty in terms of what the actual risk is, because it seems to me sometimes it felt like the risk was, especially in the beginning, was quite high, but I feel like now it's become clearer that it's much more manageable. But if you're interested in this like fear and risk perception, how does it change when you have very little idea what the actual risk is?
Yeah. I mean, that is obviously a problem with any kind of naturalistic experiment. There is no objective kind of risk. I guess what we do have is we can sort of compare to what was being floated around in the media. I think when we started this, there were reports in the media saying that something like 80% of people are going to get infected with this, things like that. So you have that kind of, it may not be the objective risk, but it's what people are learning, what they're seeing in the news. But the other fact is that it doesn't necessarily matter so much, perhaps, as the subjective risk, so what people actually perceive. If we just take it that COVID presents a risk of some extent, then the interesting thing to me is more how do people perceive it to be a risk for them and a risk for other people in the country. Even if we don't know the objective risk, we can't. Well, I know some people may deny it's a risk at all, but for the vast majority of us, we accept that it is some level of risk, and then it's kind of up to us to decide how bad it is for each of us individually, and that's quite interesting. Yes, but it would be nice to have a more concrete idea of the risk. And I think you're right that it was definitely. Thing is, I don't know whether it actually was that. It was kind of. It seemed more to be more of a risk at the start, or whether it's just that we were more uncertain about it at the start. it may be that, if you think about like the confidence intervals on our estimate of risk, perhaps the upper bound on that was just far higher, maybe, or something like that. So what's quite interesting is we have tried to ask people this. I've not really looked at the data for this, but we did ask people, so how likely do you think you are to get infected, and how confident are you about that? I again, haven't looked at the data, so I can't reveal any exciting results to you there, but so we might be able to get some kind of index of whether it is related more, whether their anxiety is related more to their uncertainty, or their actual kind of perceived risks of getting it.
Yeah, I mean, from a like personal perspective, in the beginning, it seemed to me that there was much more talk about getting infections from touching things, so like from door handles or whatever, something like that. Whereas now it seems to me that a lot more has switched to this, aerosol-based transmission through the air. And to me, some of that has made it like just on personally, just so much easier to manage, because okay, wear a mask, everyone else wears a mask. Then it's pretty much not much of a problem. Whereas in the beginning, it seemed like anything you touch might carry the virus and infect you.
Yeah, and I mean, like that sort of kind of perception is presumably adaptive, right? It's best in that situation where you don't know where the infection is going to come from to just be kind of scared of everything. And you're right, as things have progressed, as the science on that side of things has become more advanced, we know that we don't necessarily should be kind of worrying about literally everything we touch. But maybe we do need to be more concerned about aerosols and things. So yeah, I guess like the exact nature of the risk that people are facing every day has changed quite substantially. Both in that, I don't know, maybe it's either kind of greatened or lessened, but also that people have become more certain about where that risk comes from. It's interesting. That's not something we've asked people about, and perhaps we should have done, because we just didn't really think about that at the start.
I mean, we also didn't ask. So we collected data 3 times in mid-March, beginning of April, mid-May.
Yeah,
and we didn't ask about masks until May.
Yeah, we didn't either,
because we just didn't know it was like gonna like it didn't seem to us like a big factor at the time.
Yeah, not at all. It's really strange now, like looking at the questions we were using then, and I mean we've kind of had to stick with them because we're doing this longitudinally, and you can't just change the questions. But a lot of them don't really seem that sensible anymore. We didn't ask about masks at all. Like it's an obvious thing to ask now, but back in March, no one was even considering that here. It also would have been. I know I've not really looked into it in too much detail, but I know there have been studies done on this, like in Asia, for example, countries where mask wearing is a fairly normal phenomenon. So I don't know, what those results have shown. Perhaps there was people were kind of taking all these preventative measures anyway, whereas we showed that they've kind of grown as the pandemic has gone on. I don't know.
Yeah. So, what question do you wish you'd have asked right from the start? Like if you could return the time and insert some new questions. Oh,
that's a very good question.
Other than wearing masks. I mean, like one thing that I just thought about just now whilst we were talking about it is also the duration of the interaction. Yeah. So that's something we didn't. I mean, we asked different social contexts, and that to some extent, you're going to spend more time with a friend or with your family than with someone you see in a supermarket, right? Like a random stranger you walk past. So it's kind of implicit in there, but we didn't.
Yeah. I think we asked similar things where it's kind of implicit, but we didn't tackle that directly. I think it would definitely be nicer to have asked about all these different sources of risk and how people perceive them changing as time goes on, all these things that we just didn't think about before. Also, I think just people's level of knowledge about kind of pandemics and respiratory viruses in general, which we just kind of didn't really think to ask, partly because we ourselves didn't know much about it. I think all of us were kind of a bit ignorant at the start. I think it would have been nice as well to get a better idea of how people perceive the course of the pandemic to run. So we did start asking questions about that later on, but I think at the start.
So you mean like how long it's going to take, or
and how much then, and yes, and how bad it will get, I guess, because I think from what I saw, in the early stages, at least in America and I think Europe as well, people were like, this is going to be a couple of months. It might be a bit bad, but it's not going to be too awful. And then, what happened. So it would have been quite interesting, I think, to see how people's expectations change. So we have started asking people in later stages, like how long they think it's going to go on for. But we only started asking them at that, like, I think maybe like July or something. So, but it would have been very interesting to see, because I imagine, in March, people would have gone from thinking like this will be over in a month gradually to this will be over in a year or more or something.
Now it seems to me, I mean, from what I've heard, is like there will be, once we get a vaccine, whenever that's going to be the case, it's going to still take ages to produce it and then distribute it to first the people who actually need it on a daily basis. And until the general population gets it, it might be quite a while, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty about that because we don't yet have an approved vaccine. And like the FDA, threshold for effectiveness, I think is 50%. So it has to prevent 50% of infections. So you could still have a vaccine out there that isn't massively effective. So
I heard these calculations, even if it's not mandatory, right? Then you get like a lot of people can't be bothered or don't want to. Then you have like 70 to 50% actually getting it, and then only 50% of that time it works. Yeah. So I mean, there are certainly potential situations where even having a vaccine doesn't really kind of stop it entirely. I mean, I think there are plenty of epidemiologists and saying that it's possible that it just becomes endemic and it never really goes away. And I think like that we've not asked anyone about how they feel about that possibility. I think that maybe would have been something we should have asked about, because as far as I can see, it's reasonably likely. I think it's the sort of thing that people aren't necessarily. I think my I don't know, I could be wrong, but my feeling is that the public perception is basically we'll get a vaccine, this will all be over, we can go back to life as normal. And while we hope that is the case, it might not be. I don't know how much people think that is a likely event or how they feel about it. I think it's still. I would imagine it's still thought of as a kind of there'll be a cutoff in a few months, and then it will just be gone.
Yeah. Because I mean that, like, I think certainly, based on sort of prior pandemics, we've built up like an expectation of what's going to happen. If you think about like H1N1 and the original SARS, I know that obviously caused a fair few deaths and spread fairly widely, but eventually they just kind of died out of their own accord. And I feel like that's probably what most people's expectations have been based on. So we kind of expect it to, run its course, die out, and that's it. Even, going back to 1918 flu, that, it took longer, but that's eventually what happened. But we don't know for sure that's what.
How long did that take to kill everyone, to go away?
I can't remember.
No idea, actually.
I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 years. I can't remember. I don't know. I'm not a viral historian. But I mean,
which
it did go away. But
that would have been.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, definitely would have been. But then, like, there are. I think because this is quite the way this virus behaves, the fact that it can spread so easily without killing people, and then people die later on, means that it will spread far more easily, and then it may be that it ends up just circulating in the population forever, and you can't stop it. I mean, especially if vaccines, it seems like vaccines are likely not to be the kind of vaccines that will just stop you getting infected forever, for example. So it may just be that this is a risk that we have to live for forever. I mean, this is kind of worst case scenario. It might not happen, and I'm not someone who knows enough about this to make a prediction.
Also, the first vaccine doesn't have to be the best, right? It just has to be better than nothing, and then you're
true. Yeah.
Already. So maybe we'll get one that's 80-90% efficacy, but
possibly
in 3 years or whatever.
Yeah. And the other possibility is that, we develop treatments that can mean that you're very unlikely to die from it anymore. And then there's not so much of a motivation to vaccinate people, because if you end up in hospital, you get this magical treatment and you're fine. So we don't know how things will run. But I feel like it would have been nice to ask people more about how they think things are going to end. And it would have been nice as well. I don't think we'll end up doing this, but then it would be nice to kind of follow people up maybe next year and see how their expectations, at some point this year, compare to what actually happens next year and how they feel about that. But you could always do more.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I found so impressive with your in your paper, that you actually collected data for almost a week straight every day. I thought that was pretty impressive.
It was a busy week.
Yeah, I was about to say, just from a practical perspective.
Also, what's in the paper was maybe only 20% of what we're actually doing that week, because we also collected data on two or three, I think two tasks that people did, that I basically had to code up and put together in that week, which took forever. It was an absolute nightmare of a week, and I barely slept, I think. But
but did you actually? So one thing. So I mean, our preprint, I think, was to some extent a similar story to yours, that we just had this idea. I mean, in our case, we had this idea on a Friday, I think, or my supervisor sent an email around saying, hey, maybe we can help in some way or something. We know some stuff related to, especially he'd done stuff about optimism bias and that kind of stuff. And he said, maybe we can provide, help somehow, provide some sort of information about this situation, how people are dealing with it. And just said, so he sent that email on Friday, and then we talked about it on Saturday, and then, created the study on Sunday, collected the data on Monday, analyzed on Tuesday, wrote on Wednesday, published on Thursday.
Okay. We weren't the only ones being quite so rapid with it.
No, but the thing is, I really enjoyed it. It was, especially for academia, you have this, you often have these projects that take forever, right?
Yeah.
And here you go within 6 days from idea to preprint is stupid. But, and I'm really glad that we don't seem to have made any major errors. That's also nice.
Yeah, no, same.
It seems we got that, we dealt with that. But, I just found it so almost exhilarating to
absolutely
just have a project that just goes so fast and makes progress. And
it's
not going to happen again, I don't think.
Oh no, we never get to do anything that fast, and you're right. It's like there as well. There's I don't know if the work we've done will have had any real world benefit, but there's a potential that it could have done. And normally we're thinking either what we're doing is quite basic psychology, neuroscience, whatever, which may have some long-term benefits way down the road, or we're working in something related to mental health, perhaps, which we hope might have more immediate benefits, but even then it's kind of uncertain. It's quite nice to be working on something where this could have a fairly immediate helpful effect somewhere. It might not do, but there's potential for that, and it's better that we know stuff about this and put that information out there than we don't. And actually, I'm beginning to hear your thoughts on this, because I know around the time since then, there's definitely been a lot of people on Twitter who've been very critical of kind of rapidly produced COVID research. I think that's more aimed at people more in the medical sciences, who are perhaps putting out stuff about antibody prevalence and stuff like that, which is wildly overestimated and things like that, where they have more immediate public health concerns. But I don't know how I think kind of balancing getting the work out there ASAP, because it's important and timely, versus making sure everything is done thoroughly is a difficult sort of line to tread. And I think we've managed to do it fairly successfully. And, we've made all our data and code and everything open so that if there are mistakes, hopefully people can spot them. But, that's something that's kind of always been on my mind since we've been doing this. I don't know how you feel about it. whether you've had the same concerns.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few ways to answer that or to talk about that point. And the first thing I think, just in the initial week of actually doing it, before there were these criticisms, or at least before I was aware of them, we almost did it in a way that my supervisor and I, so Christoph Korn and I, we pretty much did the thing, and then the other 3 authors just made sure we didn't make anything really stupid. That was almost the way we did it, because we were just so in the zone and just doing it that we just needed people to just check that we weren't doing something catastrophically dumb. And so in a sense, we were very aware of that as we were doing it, and we tried to kind of build up a system that would ensure that we don't make errors. And then, but I think, just briefly about the criticism, I think a lot of the criticism was aimed towards people doing psychological research online, right? I thought that was the main criticism in terms of now everyone has an idea about corona.
Yes, you're right.
Puts a questionnaire online and publishes something. I thought that was actually the criticism that.
With regard to that, I think there were maybe 2 streams of criticism. One of which was more aimed at the medical profession, where it's more like, you're putting out studies that could influence how we treat this and prevent it, and they need to be, people's lives are at stake. And then there's psychology, where people's lives aren't at stake. As important as we think we are, people's lives likely aren't at stake based on their work. But there are a lot of people, I think, being criticized for perhaps, opportunism and kind of jumping on and maybe just not thinking things through properly. And I mean, I know, I don't know whether you and Christoph have had the same experiences, but I have received a lot of review requests since publishing on COVID. Like, I literally seem to get one every day, pretty much asking me to review a paper about COVID. And I mean, some of them I've seen have been great and clearly really interesting, and others just don't really seem to have been thought through at all. I don't think the criticisms that may be entirely justified, but it's certainly partially justified, because there definitely are, examples of people just kind of, putting a questionnaire online and without really thinking it through at all.
So I haven't received any review requests, but I'm not corresponding author, so my email isn't on the thing. With Christoph, I don't know. I mean, he has received some, but I don't know whether it's one a day. I don't know. But also, I think your paper is also more prominent than ours.
Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. I think if anything, yours is probably better done. I don't know.
I don't know. Well, you have the longitudinal thing in the.
I guess.
Right, we don't have that, so I think that's one thing I actually quite like, is that they are in some sense complementary. I think they're about the same thing, almost exactly, but in different ways. But wait, what did I want to say? I mean, so I understand the criticism about opportunism, because in a way, these things do receive right now, or at least our papers both received a lot more citations than most papers would receive in that short amount of time, right? There's definitely some sort of benefit from it, but I mean, we were also talking about this, whilst we were doing it, are we just taking advantage of the situation? And I think we thought that, well, as you said earlier, there is this trade-off between speed and accuracy, and in this, I mean, that's the whole basis of what your paper is, and ours also to some extent. It's just this can't be repeated very well. I mean, in some sense it can be, because there's a pandemic, not a pandemic, but there's some virus floating around every 5 years. If you think about, there was Zika at the Rio Olympics in 2016, right? And then, well, since the 2000s, there's been swine flu. Bird flu. There's one every 5 years. But,
they're common.
Actually, so I wanted to I kind of wanted to put this later in the conversation, but let's talk about it now. And this is the general thing of how to do good science in this situation. So whilst we're talking about it, so I mean, in some sense, I feel like doing good science during a pandemic is like doing good science in any other situation.
Yeah.
You have to do some things. But there is a difference of that you have to move fast to get the early data, right? Because of, I mean, I don't want to ask too specific a question, but do you have any advice or like how, or something that maybe you would have done differently, or
I think,
or maybe just broadly. So just to make this a more broader question than pandemics or something, right? This is more specific, or this is a general question about situations where there is some sort of natural experiment where you have a very short time window to react. It might be, like you said, something like a terrorist attack or something, where there's been lots of research or whatever. So it's not just about.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you can't necessarily expect everything to be perfect. You know, if you were to spend, months developing questionnaires and everything like that, you would get no data. And so you have to just kind of accept that perhaps the science that comes out of it won't be perfect, but it's going to be there. It's going to exist, and it might be somewhat informative, even if it's not perfect. So first, I think like you can't afford to be a perfectionist, and you have to accept that it may be suboptimal. The other thing is that like, I think it's important to be aware of what's already out there. That's something I would have been. I mean, I say I would have done this differently. I would have read more literature, but I didn't have time.
During that week.
Still, yeah, exactly. But I think like in hindsight, there are definitely things that I could have done better in terms of maybe reaching out to people who know more about certain aspects of the pandemic psychology than I do. For example, when we went through the review process for our paper, I think we had someone review it who was a social psychologist and kind of alerted us to literature in that area that I just wasn't aware of, but would have been quite nice to know about when we'd done the study. I think if I'd spent a bit more time kind of researching stuff, then maybe I could have developed some better questions to ask people, which would have been good. But yeah, you can't just kind of, again, you have to accept that it's not going to be perfect, and you can't just spend, a month just reading every kind of paper that's out there. And I think one thing that remains important, I think is important all the time, but particularly in, when things are inevitably going to be somewhat rushed, is to make your materials, whether it's code, data, everything openly available, so that if there are errors, hopefully they will be spotted. And also, posting preprints is helpful because, work like I think both of ours got quite a lot of attention. And presumably if there had been any major errors in there, they would have been identified. I know I saw at least one other preprint put up, in the early days of this pandemic where some, I think, fairly major errors were spotted. And, I'm not going to name the names, but spotted on Twitter by someone who read the preprint. The authors were very good about it. They corrected it, and and it worked out. It was fine. But making sure things are available in preprint form before they're finally published does at least mean there can be this kind of sort of dialogue between people, and concerns can be addressed. I mean, this is a whole other topic, but I think we've seen that across all sorts of fields, preprints have been very important this year because, in every field from, medicine, epidemiology, psychology, people have kind of had to rely on them to get the information out there. And there's certainly been a lot of activity on Twitter discussing those preprints. And I think for the first time, perhaps you've had this interesting kind of like leakage of that like scientific discourse around these preprints into the public domain as well, where the preprints are getting reported in the news, and as well as discussions are happening on Twitter between scientists getting reported into the news. I've even seen, but the fact that whatever field you're in, the fact that those results are out there and can be discussed and criticized and everything before there is a final published article out there, I think has been quite important. Yeah, even if it to maybe to the outside observer, it looks like everyone's fighting over everything. I think that's beneficial. So yeah, I think
what I found really funny, or we found quite funny, was that. So I completely agree what you said about the open science stuff. I think, especially in this kind of situation, it's, well, I mean, you could also argue everyone's doing it, so no one has time to check on whether anyone else made a mistake. So in some sense, if everyone, it's a flood of information then again to some extent. But what I found, well, in a way very good, but just a bit over the top, was that when we published our preprint, as I said, I mean, people don't know this, but this was within 6 days, right? And when my supervisor posted this on Twitter, one of the comments was, "Your data's not open. Where's your data?" Basically, like, guys, we've had it for 3 days. Like our code is not exactly. I mean, it works and everything, but it's not like neat and presentable in that sense. And, well, we actually haven't. We then decided like we're going to not do it like bit by bit, but we're just going to.
Fair enough.
Publish a new preprint and then put everything out there. But in a way, I was very encouraged that the expectation was, if there's a paper, the data should be out there, which I don't, you wouldn't have had that kind of assumption a few years ago, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've also seen multiple things on Twitter where people have been criticised for this, and I think that's fine, because that is the most obvious way to be able to check these things, right? I mean, you're right that we're kind of overwhelmed and not everyone has time to do this, but I've seen examples of people literally going through papers and checking these things and finding errors or not. So I think that we're now expecting this. It's probably a good thing, not just for pandemic science, but for science more generally. Hopefully this is something that will extend to I don't know, any other sort of naturalistic experiments that may occur. Hopefully we don't have anything like this again, but you're right.
Optimistic.
They do tend to come around quite a lot. I would say that these kind of open science practices have been very helpful during this pandemic.
Is it, so I know you've used preprints outside of this work. Is it something that you do with everything you do, or do you follow specific rules when to use a preprint, when not to publish one? Or because it seems to me, at least, doing like non-clinical or this, well, I guess irrelevant whether it's clinical or not, but for the stuff I do, it seems to me there's no reason not to just publish the preprint when you submit a paper.
Yeah, no, I would now put preprints up for pretty much everything. There's only one instance recently where I haven't, which is just because I basically have used a task developed by someone else, and that person hasn't got their original paper out about it yet, and I want them to. Okay. I want them to be the first one to have their task out there rather than me kind of stealing it. So out of respect for their kind of developing the task. But other than that, like, I can't really see any circumstances. Like, most journals are fine with it now, because a couple of years ago, some journals were still taking the view that if it's preprint, we won't consider it. I know,
but no important
also
ones, right? No? Or are there journals?
I think even a couple. I'm assuming they've changed this now. I think even a couple of years ago, Science were taking that view. I think they put out an editorial or something. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm fairly sure I remember seeing this where they were saying, or at least heavily implying, that if something is a preprint, they won't consider it.
Well, that's going to be a huge problem for all of my papers.
Yeah.
That's always the first journal to submit to.
Yes, exactly. I bet now, if you don't get a paper in Science, you can explain that it's just because you put preprints.
Yeah. I'm an advocate for open science. That's
Yeah. But I mean, it depends how far you go back. But even, I think if you go back like 4 or 5 years ago, even though preprint servers were in existence, I think many journals would have been far more skeptical about it. There's also the fact that the preprints are a new phenomenon, and they're not how science has been done, at least within our field, for many, many years. So people who are more established in the field, people who are in the kind of more senior ranks, I know have been more resistant to it, partly because they don't understand it. And it's like, in the past, if you were to put some results out there before they're published, someone would scoop you perhaps, or something like that. which
but that's the opposite, right? Almost
exactly.
Like you can prevent being scooped by putting a preprint out.
Exactly. Yeah. If your preprint is out there first, then you're the first ones to have done it. So you're right. It kind of prevents you from being scooped. But I
always feel like if your work is so simple to copy that someone else could just copy it immediately and then publish it before you.
Yeah.
What is your research then? If someone can copy it within 2 months or something?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a distinction between maybe if you tell someone about a study you're going to run, in the future, someone could perhaps take that idea and run it instead of you. And I don't know, I've heard about that happening occasionally. It presumably does. But if you're at the stage where you have a paper and you're going to put a preprint up, you're right. It'd have to be so simple for someone to go in and run it and get it published before. It
seems like a very theoretical thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
The seniority thing is something that I've noticed I'm a PhD student now, and in kind of the application cycle during which I got this position, I applied for quite a few other positions and talked to applying about other positions too. And I always asked how people thought about open science practices. This was just one thing I just always asked about. So how do you think about pre-registration, all these kind of things? And it did seem to me that there was an inflection point.
Yeah.
That's the word, right? At maybe 45 years or something.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure, but somewhere around in the 40s, people there was this, if they were younger than that, then it was oh yeah, sure, we do that. And if it was older than that, then a fair amount of people said, well, they started talking very broadly about science once you brought up the topic. Whereas if they were younger, they just said yeah, we do that. I guess I don't know, it's really weird because it doesn't seem that revolutionary to someone like me who more or less grew up with that being not the norm, but being talked about at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I guess if that was just never something that was considered, then it's not going to be on your radar. And I want to I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I feel that people who are more senior just are kind of unaware of it more than they're actually against it. And I mean, I've seen that when people have become exposed to it, they've come on board. Like when people realize that actually preprints prevent you from getting scooped, and when I pre-registered stuff, for example, that can come in quite handy, even if you put aside the fact that it's good practice in terms of doing good science. The fact that you get reviewers' comments and they want you to do extra analyses, and you can say, well, our pre-registration said that we wouldn't do those kind of things because of this, that, and then the kind of more senior person might see oh, actually this is helping us deal with these reviewers' comments that have always been a nightmare.
Wait, have you actually pre-registered what you won't do? I never thought about it that way.
Not so much, but or more that it's sometimes you might get a reviewer who wants you to change your analysis and say, you've done this in this particular way, but I think you should do it in this way, even when that might not be really the best way to do it. And ordinarily you probably have to agree to them, and that new analysis would gain some prominence when perhaps it shouldn't do. When if you pre-registered something, you said, I'm going to do it in this way, then you have a bit more leeway to be actually, sorry, we can't put your way of doing things at the forefront of the paper because we've already said we do it this way. So there have definitely been examples where pre-registration has helped me with that. Also, actually, I remember that for one paper, I think I had a reviewer saying, they clearly even though the pre-registration was mentioned in the paper, they clearly hadn't seen it or read it, and they said, this analysis looks like it was just done post hoc. I don't believe that you ever kind of pre-planned this. And we just be like,
wow.
Oh no, see the pre-registration. It's literally right there.
Here's a link.
Yeah. So it's definitely, so I think when you get those kind of things, even if you do have someone who perhaps doesn't see the actual kind of benefits of science, they'll see that, from a selfish point of view, it's actually quite helpful as well. Yeah.
I mean, I should maybe also say, I am aware that there are many people who are older than 45 who are into open science. I don't want to.
I know, yeah. Oh, no.
And I do understand some potential problems associated with it, because, I mean, I have one thing that it's basically ready to submit, but I just want to finalize the code and make it look properly readable because I want to make it open. And that's, otherwise I probably would have not published it, but at least submitted it already. So I'm aware that it is a time effort involved in it that you just wouldn't have otherwise. But then again, I also feel like I'll probably write my code better. Yeah. Because I know, I'm very nervous that people will read this and just tear it to shreds, right? So I have to do well.
Yeah. And I've actually, I had one example where in doing that process, like trying to go through my code, make sure it all kind of worked properly, looked nice. I caught a bug that actually changed my results, and I would not have noticed that if I hadn't done that. So you're right, it definitely has benefits, even though it is an early cost. But also, you basically almost have to write another paper just in code to go along with the actual paper, which is a bit frustrating. But.
Yeah. And I am aware that ideally, independent of whether someone sees your work, you should do well, right? Yes. But I think just knowing that people will actually see it or be able to see it, I think, especially if you deal with the reality of doing research under time pressure and these kind of things, I think it is very easy to not look over it again.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, the more work I put into making the code and stuff openly available, the more the paper itself seems less important, because what I try to do now is, and at least all the kind of important analysis code, I'll put in a Jupyter notebook. So then you have the code, you have the outputs, you have everything, you have comments that explain things, and then when you have that, the results section of the paper just seems so limited in comparison. And I kind of almost find that sometimes I'm putting more effort into the code than making the code look readable than I am the actual paper, which is
have you ever referenced a Jupyter notebook rather than supplementary information?
I haven't. No,
sorry, can you briefly explain what a Jupyter notebook is for the people who don't? I mean, I don't know Python either, but at least I know roughly what it is. But for those,
so the idea of a notebook, whether it's Jupyter or RMarkdown or any of these formats, is basically that you have this page that you can view in a web browser that has the code and the outputs that the code generates. So if you have some code to produce a figure, you'll have the code and the figure all in one place. And alongside that, you can use a language called Markdown to basically write comments and explanations, put in tables, everything like that. So you have this document that, as well as include text, includes your code, includes what that code produces. So you can basically talk someone through an entire analysis pipeline with the code, explanations, outputs, everything in one place. So there are the two major formats are Jupyter Notebook, which was developed with Python in mind, but also works for R and Julia and things. Then there's RMarkdown, which is specifically for R, but I think nowadays can do Python as well. So they're intermixing. But yeah, either of these formats do basically the same thing. And so, once you've kind of used this format, a result section of the paper that doesn't have any code or anything like that just seems, to be lacking half the information that's actually necessary to understand what you did.
So you'd recommend reading your notebooks rather than your results section?
Probably, yes. Yeah. And the great thing is that, if you want to, then you can download the notebooks on GitHub, you download it with the data, and you can then just run the whole thing yourself. So if you want to change something in the analysis pipeline, you do it and you'll see the results there. So it becomes almost an interactive results section. So yeah, it has so
I really
many
need to
more
get
benefits.
into that. I'm still doing it the old way, which is just so cumbersome.
I do use R?
MATLAB right now, but I mean, I basically want to switch to Python for a while. Let's just leave it as vague as that. I mean, I have used R before also, but so many years ago that by now I've almost forgotten how to use it entirely. So it's been mainly MATLAB for the last few years, and but I definitely want to switch to Python. And
because I don't think I'm not aware of any kind of notebook format really for MATLAB. I could be wrong about that, or at least not as highly developed as Python. So one of the great things about Python and R as well that I think maybe guys underappreciated in the scientific community is that they are languages which are used extensively and developed intensively by people outside science, whereas MATLAB is basically scientists and that's it. So you have all these tools that emerge that weren't designed for us, but can be quite helpful, like notebooks. I think they came about from data scientists wanting to be able to explain what they're doing to other people in the company.
Which is what scientists want to do. Yeah,
exactly. But we don't have the time or, I don't know, creative freedom, I don't know, to be able to come up with something like that.
So, I mean, this is now a very much a speculative question about the future of publishing, but do you think that something like there will be online interactive papers where the notebook will be integrated instead of the results section or something like that?
People are trying it. eLife, for example, have started doing this.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah, I think only recently, and I don't know how many papers they have using this format. So yeah, in principle, I think people are trying to make it work. I don't know how much it will catch on or how quickly it will catch on, because I think people quite like papers as they are. And which, I don't know, I'm not a massive fan of papers as they are, but I know lots of people who are, of my generation who will still like exclusively read papers on paper. Like
I do that.
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all. I don't do it myself, but I know plenty of people who like to sit down and read a paper as a physical object. And an interactive notebook is never going to give you that experience. And so,
it would be like two different versions, I guess, right?
Yeah. So I think that's what we'll probably end up doing. We'll have our interactive code online. We'll have the paper version. It's a bit annoying because then you have to like duplicate the workload essentially. But I don't know.
You're already doing that, right?
Yeah.
But so what? Okay, so to slightly play devil's advocate here. So what would be the advantages having the notebook version? Because it seemed to me the results section should tell you what you found under the assumption that you did it correctly. Right?
Yes.
So what exactly does having the code there add, unless you like want to replicate it or use, I don't know. Yeah. What exactly does it add in terms of you understanding what the person found?
I guess one thing is that you no longer have to assume that the person did it correctly because you can see it right there. A second, it's more feasible to include interactive elements. So if you want figures that are interactive, you can do that without too much of a problem.
Interact, like what would be an example?
So I don't know, for example, you have a lot of data that you want to show in a scatter plot or something like that, and you want to select various variables to show or hide, things like that. Or like, time courses that you might want to zoom in on, things like that. So that's another element that you can't have in a normal results section. The other thing that I found very helpful is from a learning point of view. If you are reading a results section where you can't see like how they've actually done stuff, you then have to kind of delve into the methods and try and figure out what they did. And if you're trying to learn to do that kind of analysis yourself, it's not very helpful. If you literally have a results section that includes the code, when you're trying to learn yourself how to do this kind of analysis, it makes it very clear to you. So just from the point of view of kind of, learning how to do science, and, us teaching other people how to do what we've done, it can be very helpful from that perspective as well. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Like it's not always going to be necessary, but it's certainly nice to have. And the other thing as well is that, if you want to you have a notebook, you just hide the cells that do the code and you just have the results section. So, I mean, you could just...
in a way, it seems to me also it could make results section much more compact. So I was just thinking, so one problem I'm having with this study is that it's been kind of difficult to... There's so much data to present that in a usable format. Without having 50 pages of figures, right?
Yeah.
And so it would be kind of cool if you could have something like, so in our preprint we have bar plots, but we don't want to use them for most of the figures, at least in the later things. And I guess it would be kind of cool if you could just show the bar plots and then you like click on it and then it opens up like a density plot and like something like a rain cloud plot or something like that. That would be super cool, because then you can like, would it be like nested or whatever you'd call it?
Yeah.
And you can, so you have like one figure, and through interactive elements, you can see whether that would be super cool.
Yeah. And it also like, it's, you end up kind of writing out a lot of stuff in the results section anyway. All the details, the statistical tests you did, and all the, all the results from them and stuff. And, if you just have the code, then that kind of can almost replace the results section, because if you're saying, I used an ANOVA to look at this, or you just have the line of code saying you run an ANOVA to do this, it's the same sort of thing anyway.
Although, I mean, I guess is the criticism or one of the obstacles here that then everyone has to learn that programming language?
Potentially, yeah. That's a downside. Yeah, no, I'm perhaps going a bit extreme there. Perhaps you shouldn't kind of replace all of the text with code. But certainly in the output of the code, where you can, for example, say you've done loads and loads of tests for whatever reason, and, in a results section, have some very big table that gives you all the outputs. If you just have something interactive where you can kind of click around and see what the results are, then it's a lot simpler to use. I think like as a kind of timely analogy, like I don't know if you've been following the American election, but there are lots of I think
more than I want to.
Yeah, most of the world have, but like many like news websites like New York Times, Washington Post, whatever, have had all these nice interactive like graphics where you can see how the results are changing, how they're coming in. 538 have their prediction model where you can change things and see how things work out. If you imagine, like, if they were to have instead done that and written it up as a traditional results section in a paper, like how inferior that would be to these interactive things that we get online instead.
That's actually the perfect analogy, because I guess I think I looked at The Guardian for this. They have this, and I assume most will have something like this. You will have whoever won whatever state, and then you click on it, and then you see for the counties or whatever it is in the US.
Yeah.
For the small subparts. And I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking about with the figures. You have like one overview, what the main result is, and then you can zoom in to the more granular level. Yeah.
And actually, we've seen the same thing with going back to COVID as well, where there've been lots of kind of online dashboards people have created, or that governments have created, where you can view testing results and things like that, which part of the reason that's useful in that circumstance is because the data is constantly being updated. That's not necessarily the case in a scientific paper, but it also means that you can look at different areas quite easily in one interactive kind of site. You can zoom in on, if you want to see what the test positivity rate of this particular county was in April, you can do that. Just zoom in and and you see the data. Whereas again, like you would lose so much information if you had to write that kind of stuff up as we do with ordinary result sections.
Yeah. Then you just have to cut so much stuff, right? You just have to
I'll admit I've not used these interactive things as much as I should have done. It's something I want to do more. The problem I face right now is that because I have to make loads of figures for the paper, it's then annoying to have to go and basically duplicate them to make them interactive online. But I think as in the future, I'm hoping this will become a more common thing to do.
And it seems that with Python, you're on a pretty solid path to being used, like using one of the things that will be used in the future for, or is already.
Yeah. So that's helpful, I guess. But, yeah. But what I'm hoping we'll do at some point is, with the data we've collected from our COVID study, we'll put together like an interactive dashboard where you can view all the results. I already have a prototype that sort of works.
Okay.
And I mean, just from me to use when I've been looking at the data we've collected so far, it's been so nice because we have so many questions done at different time points and different samples, and I would highly recommend learning languages that can do these things.
I definitely want to switch. I mean, it's the same conversation as always. It's just more convenient to do what you know how to do. Even though long term, it's probably beneficial to, make the switch.
If you're currently doing a PhD, that's the perfect time to do it. It might not seem like it, but it is the time when you're supposed to be learning these new things. So I don't know, just tell Christoph that you're going to take 3 months off and learn Python.
Yeah. I don't know, I think I'll just start with some very small projects I have that are very easy to analyze and just get my, what's the phrase? Feet wet.
Yes.
Yeah.
But my way of doing it was basically like anytime I have anything that could be done with Python, do it with Python. To be fair, I wasn't coming from another language. I was coming from not knowing anything, but still like just kind of forcing yourself to do it, even though it's going to take you way longer to do it in Python.
Yeah, I mean, what annoys me, and maybe I'm just being really dumb here, but I really don't like these things where you have to configure something yourself. What I like about MATLAB is you just download the thing and then it's there.
Yeah.
Whereas with Python, I have used it actually, and I kind of half made the switch and then reverted back again. Which is also in part because our testing labs here run on MATLAB. So that was part of the reason why I did that. And then I just never switched back again. Not never, not yet. But yeah, I don't like the whole, like, you have to... It was always I don't know. I had to always think about what to download, and it wasn't just you download a program and it runs. You have to kind of make it run.
Yeah, no, I get that.
That's not my kind of cup of tea when it comes to electronics, especially.
Yeah. No, you're right.
I'm just whinging.
I keep meaning to like write a quick blog post, just like explaining here is how you get it set up without too much trouble, and because I've had multiple people say the same thing to me, I feel like I've got to the stage now where I've used it so much that I can kind of get everything installed and running without problem whatsoever. But I know when I first started out, it's like, how do I even make anything work? So
but
the other reason to make that switch is that if you end up wanting a career outside academia, say you want to go into data science or something like that, no one's going to be using MATLAB, so it helps out in that respect quite a lot.
Yeah. Is it actually true? I've heard that quite a bit, but I've only heard it from scientists saying it as a hypothetical. I've never.
As in that MATLAB wouldn't be useful.
Like the exact argument you said, I've only heard from scientists who are in academia. I haven't yet so far, but I don't know. I haven't.
Yeah,
heard,
I've not worked in data science. I don't know, but I mean, like I said earlier, many of the tools that we're using were developed by data scientists. So tools in Python and R, like that is just. I mean, like the reason the machine learning stuff in Python is so good nowadays, and deep learning and everything like that, is because that's just the language people use to do that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I think I just have to do it.
Yeah,
I have to follow Nike's slogan and just do it. I think that might be the secret to learning Python, and not be so caught up in your own comfort.
Yeah.
The comfort of a program I don't really like either.
Yeah. I'm not sure anyone really loves the stuff they're using. Sorry, went a bit on a tangent there.
Yeah, but again, as I said earlier, that's kind of not the point of the podcast. But actually, I think I've already abandoned any structure for this conversation.
Okay.
So I'll just, it's still related, but one thing, it goes back to slightly to the quality in terms of quality of stuff that came out during COVID, or about COVID. And I'm curious what your experience is. So we have these, I think, something like 20 papers now that have cited us. And a shocking amount of them to me didn't really cite me properly, or us properly. I don't know whether this is just a general thing in academia that people don't really read papers properly. Is it? Okay. But I kept reading these things and thought, some were just bizarre. Luckily, I don't remember. I can't even name names, which is good. There was one where I read it and it cited us. I thought, no, we didn't. We didn't say that at all. We're in the same topic. It's about COVID.
Yeah.
We didn't say that thing at all.
Yeah.
And others getting details wrong and It's.
I've I've not looked at this for our own citations. I mean, I've definitely looked at it for other papers of mine, and it's not uncommon at all. There was, I'm fairly sure that I saw a study about this recently where they'd actually kind of investigated the quality of citations. I can't remember what it was called at all. And found that, citations are abused, basically. I mean, I found it myself. If you read a paper and they make some claim and reference someone, you're like, oh, that sounds like an interesting paper, I should read it. You go and read it, and it doesn't make the claim that the author said it did. I don't think it's uncommon at all. It's a more widespread problem. I definitely don't think it's unique to COVID. It may be that happens more often, perhaps, if people are kind of rushing things a bit. I've not looked at who has cited us that much. Perhaps I should do a bit more. I feel like our work is, from a brief look anyway, it seems like it's probably just been more cited in that, like, there has been some research done into COVID. Cite my paper. Like, that's basically it.
Yeah, I mean, one paper that cites, I mean, so I'm looking into this because, this is basically my first author.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Preprint. So this is all kind of more exciting than if you've already done this a few times. So I've, especially in the beginning, I looked at exactly what who was citing us, right? And what they were doing. And I mean, there was one paper that cited us for our assumption, basically. So we said, just something like, it might be useful to just know how people would react to this thing because ultimately any government policy depends on people actually doing it. Yeah. That was pretty much, that's just the fundamental assumption behind doing this kind of research. And people cited us saying that, we said that, I mean, we did say it, but it's just not really what we found. It's just the assumption behind it.
Yeah. But I mean, I find myself doing that sometimes because, you cite a paper because, I mean, sometimes you want to make just a really obvious statement, but you can't really do it without a citation. So, sometimes when you're just making a blanket statement, people are anxious quite a lot. People often suffer from anxiety. It's there's no paper really just saying that. So sometimes you just cite some review that just it's a statement
on the topic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at least it sounds like you've not had any negative citations. That'd be.
You mean
I don't know if we have. Yeah,
we did something wrong, or you mean something like that?
Yeah. Or saying
no, there've been some that were just bizarre in the way they cited us.
I kind of want to look at ours, but
I feel, and also, so this is something I feel kind of almost mean saying this, but one thing I found super exciting was when papers about this topic came in, that a lot of them were not from Europe or US and Europe, right? Not from the Western world, where people in Southeast Asian countries, African countries, South American countries did these studies. And we've had quite a few of those studies that did something similar to what we did, but in a different country. And I found that super cool just to, read papers from all over the world. But a lot of them were not that great. That was the thing that I found so dispiriting, and that I kind of don't want to trash people, but a lot of them were just there's maybe a reason why I don't read those papers usually, because they're just not that good.
It's I don't think it's unexpected, because we're lucky in the Western world in that we have governments that put huge amounts of, first of all, we're in relatively wealthy countries. Those governments put huge amounts of money into science. We end up being
the training of science also, right?
Exactly. And I've seen papers from countries that I know the government doesn't really spend any money on science, so you can't really blame them. Which is kind of unfair, and I think that's especially, it's kind of frustrating because COVID is a global phenomenon, and ideally it needs to be studied globally. There's no reason why you would expect our results in the United States to generalize to Europe, even let alone Indonesia or India or somewhere. So I think it's important that we do get this research done all around the world, but you're right, not every country has the infrastructure in place to be able to kind of produce such quite high quality work. I don't know how to kind of solve that, because it's a kind of it's not something we can directly help with so easily. I don't know.
You're not going to solve structural inequalities in the world on your own.
Yeah, exactly. Sadly,
I mean, some of them was also a more linguistic thing where their English just wasn't that good, which in a sense is more forgivable, and it's of course very mean if I mean, I grew up like half English, but yeah, for people who are native speakers or close to.
Oh yeah.
It is of course like an unfair competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, but I just found it so sad to think like, oh, cool, all these foreign papers, and then I mean, some of them are also good, like clearly, right?
Yeah, and actually, so interestingly, a lot of the work that had looked at responses, psychological responses to pandemics prior to COVID, did come out of China and places because that's where they've been hit by recent pandemics. So various, I can't remember which ones now. Swine flu, for example, I think started in Asia. I don't want to make false claims now. Maybe. I know there have at least been a couple of pandemics that have started in Asia. So it's the same reason, essentially, that countries like China and Japan and South Korea have been more kind of agile in adapting to the circumstances the pandemic has caused and putting in place measures to prevent the spread of the disease. That also means that they've done more psychological research into it in the past because they've had to. They've been exposed to it more than we have. And there are some, there's some really nice papers that I think we cited in ours that had shown similar things. This kind of optimism bias, for example. I can't remember which pandemic it was, but that had been shown before. So yeah, I think a lot of the research that had existed prior to COVID on psychological responses to pandemics had actually come from Asia, and there are some really nice papers actually. So yeah.
I feel like we're at as you mentioned, like the preparedness of countries. I feel like that is something that in Europe we just lack completely. I mean, I know that there are people who thought about this and are aware of this, but as a general population, I mean, any time there was something like that going on, it was always somewhere else. And I mean, like buying masks was just not like this is basically the first time I've been wearing face masks in my life. Yeah, same.
I think it would have been really nice to be able to. Again, this is the sort of thing you couldn't really set up because of the timing and everything. But if you'd been able to do some kind of cross-cultural comparison between a country like South Korea, for example, versus maybe like the United States or Germany or the UK, when the pandemic kind of first hit, and see how people adjust psychologically. Because I imagine in countries that they've done this before, you'd see less anxiety, perhaps. You'd see people just being like, well, okay, it's this again. We'll get on with it. We know what we're doing. We're sensible. We know how to cope with this. Whereas in like America, people have no idea what to do, and they have a government who's never really had to deal with this kind of scale of pandemic before, and presumably feel a lot more anxious. But I don't know. That would have been a nice comparison to be able to do.
Yeah, maybe there must be some data out maybe where you can do some sort of comparison. But then again, the questions might be a bit different. And then
exactly, yeah. I don't know.
I mean, to some extent, that's what we tried to do in our study because we collected data from the US, the UK, and Germany. So I don't want to be, how should we say, I haven't looked into the country differences too much in the longitudinal stuff and everything. But as far as I can tell, most of it's pretty similar. Even though, I mean, so these countries are, according to what you just said, similar in that they haven't had this kind of pandemic before, but they are quite different in terms of how the government reacted to it. When they were hit by it also, because in Germany, it was probably 2 weeks earlier. I don't know exactly how much earlier, but it was earlier than in the UK, which I think was again pretty much earlier than in the US.
I think so.
But it seems that there wasn't really that much of a difference. But we don't have the slight problem is we don't have huge amounts of people per country, so then it suddenly becomes a bit difficult to make these proper claims. Although, so this is one unexpected finding we had, which is maybe not that unexpected, but it's something we didn't really plan for, or we didn't expect the results to be this extreme. So we asked people how much they trusted their government to deal with the situation. And the three countries had very different responses. So the Germans were very, very supportive of their government, like almost ceiling effect level, 90% plus almost. They were like, we've got, and to be fair, that has been my reaction. So I live in Hamburg, and this has been my reaction too. I was like, they seem to take this seriously, do it properly. And
Yeah.
do
I mean,
very
I trust your government as well.
The UK had a kind of, they started off like mid-level, I think, at the beginning in terms of trust. Then it went up, actually, because I think the UK didn't get it. So that's my assumption, because you didn't have it that early. But then once it hit, it dropped lower again than initially.
Yeah.
And the US just doesn't trust at all.
Yeah.
They're like, I think they were below 30% or around 30% or something.
Yeah.
Although part of me also wonders whether that's just a general divide between in the country in general and not really related to pandemic response. But
I imagine it would be because it'd be nice to that's I think the thing that is most annoying about, I mean, obviously there's no way around this, but it would be very nice if we'd had baseline measures like pre-pandemic on all these pandemic related things. I mean, maybe we should just keep surveying people every year just in case a pandemic happens so we can do that. But yeah, because like I imagine Americans are less trustful of their government generally than Germans are. I don't know for sure, but I would guess that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one interesting thing is that I think I'm correct on this, all three countries had conservative governments. So in that sense, they are, I mean, very different kinds of conservatism, but it's not like one, had like, I mean, in principle, I think within the society, there were somewhat similar, the governments, just they reacted very differently to it. But yeah, we didn't have any baselines of,
Yeah. And
we also didn't ask for their political affiliation.
Yeah, no, we didn't either. We've only done that more recently, which is, I should have done that from the start, but didn't really consider it. I think the other problem in the US is that it's not, even though it means technically the United States, the states are so different from one another. Like, for example, in California, even though there has been basically an absence of leadership at the top of the government, the Californian governments have been dealing with it fairly well. So, if I'm asked what my overall opinion of the government here is in terms of dealing with COVID, like I'd probably be relatively positive, because the local government has been quite good. You don't have that so much at least in the UK, because, there's not, I mean, there is some level of devolution, but it's,
I mean, the UK,
if anything,
what's the counties, right?
But
there's huge amounts of them, right?
Yes, and they don't have that much power individually. The larger cities have some degree of power, and then there's obviously the four kind of constituent countries of the UK which do have more power. So I've seen that more recently. There's been the issue where Wales completely locked down when England hadn't, and then people couldn't go from England to Wales, and So you may even have a similar kind of effect there, where people perhaps in certain parts of the UK feel more trust in their government than elsewhere.
Yeah, in Germany, it's also been, so we have the federal states. There's 16, I believe. I hope I'm not wrong on this. Anyway, I think by now the people who know me know I know nothing about politics, so I think I can get away with it. But each of the different states have had different responses. Like Bavaria, or in Germany, they in general said, like, if it's more than 50 per 100,000, then I don't know what was going to happen, but they had to at least think about it or talk about it and maybe decide what to do next. I mean, that's through the window now because everything's way higher, but for a few months that was the state. But Bavaria said we're doing this at 35, I think, or something like that. So there were some minor variations in how they dealt with it. And there's also some states which are so much less densely populated and that kind of stuff that they just never had many cases anyway. Yeah.
But you also get interesting kind of points of frustration over here as well, because essentially the federal government overrules the state government, which overrules the kind of county level government. So then, if you have, for example, there are bits in California that are quite Republican, and so perhaps agree more with the federal government's approach, not their state level government approach, but they can't overrule their state level. It's, I think there's, people have become a bit frustrated with different kind of levels of government and things like that. And so there are, I think essentially the question of whether, they feel the government is handling it properly is a very complicated one, at least in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, we also had a question about what your local authorities. So we did kind of divide this a little bit, but the problem is just so we have this one longitudinal data set, which is 430 people across the 3 countries. So, you're not going to get a lot of people from each state or whatever. And I mean, you divided. So actually, you divided in your paper, you had this geographical analysis where you divided the country into 4 parts, right?
Yeah.
What was it? Was it South California?
Basically, I can't remember. Basically, northeast, southwest.
Yeah. So, what is that based on?
So that is, I'm not sure who came up with that, but I think it was a division that's used in the United States Census and various kind of government statistics. They tend to divide the states up into these 4 regions, which I guess is done based on, I don't know, cultural factors and things like that. I mean, like, just kind of intuitively, those 4 regions do kind of divide themselves culturally to some extent. I'm not American, so I don't know too much about this, but and politically as well. For example, like the Northeast is very left-leaning, as is the West Coast, whereas the sort of the Midwest and the South are generally more conservative-leaning. So yeah, but I mean, we just took those categories because they already existed, and we weren't really able to look that much at we weren't able to look very well at differences between them because it was kind of confounded by the case numbers. So the Northeast, so like New York, for example, was hit really badly quite early on. So they were socially distancing far more than people on the West Coast were, for example. But that's just because they needed to. Whereas, I mean, to be fair, we probably needed to at that point as well. We just didn't know it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we weren't really able to look at that properly. We also didn't have any finer grained location data than the state. So we couldn't really, it's something we probably should have done, but we couldn't look in any more detail, than that, which is a bit annoying.
But even, so we actually asked for the city they live in, but even that's, I mean, what are we going to do with that in hindsight? It's kind of, now it's a bit like, okay, you have a city and a state, but well, number one, we don't have enough people to really do anything with this information. But the other thing is also, even if we did, I'm still not entirely. Yeah, I mean, for the political, I guess depends on what the question is. But so for trust in the government, you could maybe use the average. Yeah, like you take the percentage of who voted for which party, and take that as a proxy for this person. Is that likely to be in favor for the government or not? But yeah, that's still very, very time consuming and probably not very. I'm not sure how likely it is you'll get an interesting result in the end. Yeah,
the other thing that we have in our data that we've not really looked at yet is there have been multiple significant kind of cultural, political, social events that have happened in the United States the last few months. So since the pandemic began, obviously there are all the massive kind of protests against racism, police brutality, and things that happened early in the year. And then there's been the election and the whole run up to the election. So we will presumably be able to look at some effects of those to see how they have perhaps kind of interacted with the things related to the pandemic, which will be interesting to see.
How would you do that?
Not sure. I've not thought about that yet. But
you've got the data and a lot of hope.
Yeah. So yeah, I think, like, for example, I imagine there'd be some degree of kind of perhaps divides along kind of political lines, but also along racial lines, particularly around when the protests were happening, because that was kind of part of that, amongst a load of other things, was highlighting the fact that Black people, other minorities in the United States have been far worse affected by the pandemic than white people. So I don't know whether we'd perhaps see some kind of effect there where I don't know what the kind of splits are in our sample. Actually, I've not checked that in a while. But perhaps, that maybe highlighted to Black people that they are, at a high risk, sadly, and therefore should, maybe perhaps made them feel more angry or anxious. I don't know. Or maybe, you had sort of more conservative leaning white people who kind of felt like, the protests are going to make everything worse and therefore showed heightened anxiety because they think that these are super spreading events. I don't know. I'd be interested to look at. It's been a very interesting year, definitely. So
this has been such a weird year.
It really has. So there's a lot of stuff we've got to look at the data, and I like on that topic. I think there's not really been enough work considering these kind of the effect of these inequalities that exist, particularly in the United States, on how people are psychologically dealing with the pandemic. I mean, it might just be that this work will come out as people kind of get it published, but the fact that you have these really kind of entrenched racial divides in the United States, and where Black people are at far higher risk of getting the disease, of dying from it once they do get it. Like, presumably that's having a far greater psychological toll on them than it is on white people who are relatively safe from it. I mean, we like in where I live in LA, it's incredibly obvious that the areas that have been affected are the poor Latino areas mostly, whereas the wealthier white areas have much lower caseloads. Like, this is not like a small split whatsoever, and presumably you'll then get kind of massive psychological effects that differ between those kind of groups. You also have the issue of where kind of poorer people generally have to kind of be confronted with risk of getting the virus because they work in occupations where they have to be amongst other people, whereas we're very fortunate. Like, we can stay home, isolate ourselves. We don't have to come into any contact with other people if we don't want to at all. And like, I think that's something that's not really been, we've not addressed that, partly because we didn't collect the data. That's another thing I probably should have done to begin with.
Data on what? You mean like on ethnicity or on socioeconomic status? Or?
Yeah, because I mean, to be honest, later on we did collect more data on socioeconomic status, and I've not looked at it yet, and also data on ethnicity, but we didn't do that to begin with in that very first week, which I think in hindsight we probably should have done. At first, to be honest, part of it was just kind of practical. Like, I wanted to, just for the sake of avoiding any questions with the IRB, I wanted to reduce the amount of like potentially personal information I collected to the minimal extent. But I think, that would have been something that'd be quite interesting to look at in more detail. We did a little, some kind of analysis on that based on like education levels in our data, but that's not a perfect measure of SES by any means. And I mean, personally, I think like, I'm not from the United States. I've only lived here like a year, and I didn't fully appreciate until this year, like just how divided the country is in terms of how well off people are. And so I didn't really necessarily consider it to be quite such an interesting question as much as I should have done until the whole year happened, and it was made blindingly obvious to many of us.
But then again, there's only so much stuff you can think of in the beginning, right? Yeah.
And the other thing as well is that I didn't want to like necessarily stray into other people's kind of research areas, because I don't want to end up, I'm sure you had the same kind of feelings where you don't want to end up kind of doing something that you don't really know anything about just because you can.
Yeah.
Like there are quite a few things we discussed in the earlier days of doing this work where it's like, oh, it'd be interesting to look at that. But then we're like, actually, we don't know anything about that. It's not really our area. We should probably let people. I mean, one example is mental health, for example. At first, I was kind of thinking, it'd be interesting to look at the mental health effects of this. But then I thought, there will be clinicians out there who are going to do this far better than I could. And we've seen those studies done and published. So we end up staying away from mental health, for example, because, we would just be doing something far more poorly than other people would. So there are quite a few questions that we perhaps also ignored just because we thought we wouldn't do them very well.
I mean, I think one thing that just occurred to me that I think is also important to bear in mind is that, at least to me, it was always very important that the questionnaire the study doesn't become too long. So we try to keep it up to like 20 minutes or something. And there's only so much you can ask with a 20-minute experiment. I mean, everything seems very easy to add on, but then suddenly it's another 5 minutes longer. And...
timing was definitely an issue because, like, I think any of us who have seen someone complete questionnaires in the lab or do a task in the lab know that after not very long, people start falling asleep essentially, and data quality diminishes rapidly. So, like, from that point of view, you don't really want someone to be sitting there answering questions for like an hour and a half. Also, obviously, we have the issue of money. Like, we have to pay people to do this. And
I mean, the more tricky thing was not to have the money to pay them, but to have the money on the Prolific account. That was the more tricky part. I think Christoph pretty much put like his private money up for the first entire data collection because with German bureaucracy, you're not going to get, because we just started like online data collection. We just kind of started doing that with Prolific, and with German bureaucracy, you're not going to get 1,000 or 3,000 euros onto an account within like a day. That's just not going to happen.
I think I was like doing it myself to begin with as well, and a bit of a nightmare. But
I think we were very back by now. But
I hope so. we were very lucky to. So Dean managed to get a grant from Caltech. So Caltech actually put out this funding call saying, the Merkin Institute at Caltech put out this funding call saying, we want studies looking into the effects of COVID.
Oh, really?
So we applied for that.
Then. Or was that?
Yeah. Oh, no, it's very
like
fast.
At the beginning.
So it was, I think, within a month or two afterwards. So the first part we had to find other sources of money for. But
I see. Okay.
But from then on, we were, it was very generous of them to give us the money to cover the rest of it, which obviously allowed us to extend it far longer than we would have done otherwise. We were fortunate in that sense because otherwise, you can't really just keep going for months with no money.
Especially if you've been doing it every 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's cost a fair bit of money, and I mean, hopefully it'll turn out to be worth their money. I'm hopefully it will. One other thing is that I've seen a lot of studies that haven't paid people for participating. And that's something I always feel kind of like ethically on the fence about because, like, I mean, I know that people are happy to do it because they want to contribute, and that's fine. But equally, I kind of feel bad not compensating people for their time.
That's what Prolific is also so adamant about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you have to pay them like €5 an hour, £5.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but then when you have like some of the really large scale studies of mental health, for example, that I've seen particularly in the UK, which I don't think have paid people just because they've ended up getting tens of thousands of people to do them, and paying people would be a kind of a hindrance in that respect because, I mean, A, you need to find the money, but B, just like the infrastructure of like setting up a payment system to pay like 80,000 people, it's just like, you can't get everyone to sign up to Prolific just to do it. So I don't know. That's something that I've been kind of uncertain about over time. I didn't want to myself not pay people, but I appreciate it. In other circumstances, that's kind of been the only way to do it, and people have been apparently very happy to kind of participate for free.
I feel like in this situation, it does seem to me it's a bit different. I mean, in a way, also, I feel like so my PhD is not on this topic exactly. So I don't, in that sense, didn't have still don't really have the precise knowledge and expertise about risk perception of these things. I mean, we have other people, Christoph and Julia Ogania, and I don't know whether Gabriela, but the other two definitely have published on this before. So that comes from their perspective, and I'm more know how to run these online studies and do it fast and the kind of generic science stuff. And now I forgot where I was going with this. Wait, what were we talking about?
Paying people money and stuff. And
exactly.
Online.
Exactly. So in some sense, I also feel like I am giving away time for my PhD for this. That's not related to my thesis. I mean, in some sense, it is actually, this is, I'm so smooth in my transition. If I hadn't just said how smooth I am, because it's something I did want to ask you about, is whether this, how much this relates to your kind of normal work, or to, it seems to me maybe to you it's more related than to me, where it really is just something that's completely different.
Yeah.
But I was just curious how you think about this, also in terms of, or maybe let's just keep it at that, and then I'll ask other questions later.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not like literally what I had planned to do during this postdoc that I'm on. But it's ended up being, it fits very nicely with what I was kind of intending to do, because everything I'm doing normally is in the lab, looking at how people learn about kind of threat, basically, and how it relates to mental health. And this essentially is kind of allows me to test a similar hypothesis in the real world. So it's not quite the same, but it definitely allows me to kind of answer the same questions in different ways. One other thing that we have collected data for, that we plan to do, is I've used a task that I've used in the lab before online in the people doing the study, that looks at how people learn about threat and safety. And so I've not looked at the data yet, so I don't know what the results are, but this will give us an opportunity to look at whether what we find in that task kind of translates to reality, whether people who learn about threat more in this kind of very contrived task do actually learn about real world threat more quickly. And that sort of external validation is something that we don't do very often, mostly because it's just very hard to do, because, how often is it that people are exposed to a serious like threat like this in real life? It's very rare. So I think, as well as being kind of generally just sort of another way of testing the hypotheses that I want to test, it also gives me a way to validate stuff that I can otherwise validate. The other thing is that I think we bring perhaps a different perspective to this kind of research, because generally this work on risk perception is done by people in other kind of areas of psychology, particularly in social psychology, for example, where there's a lot of work on how people perceive risks from various things in their environment. But it's quite interesting then for us to come in from this more kind of lab-based way of doing things and think about how we might be able to explain how people react to threat in the real world, when it's not usually even though we know a lot about it in the lab, it's not really normally our area.
Yeah. I was just want to ask about the validation you mentioned. If you can't control this real life experiment of the pandemic properly, and you can't measure everything properly, how do you know whether you're not, like, if it doesn't validate, are you not validating it because you can't control, like, the actual,
yeah,
you know what I mean? I'm not making a clear sentence here, but
yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be that caveat, isn't there, that this is a very uncontrolled real life situation, and so if something doesn't predict real world behavior, it may just be that it's because the real world is so unpredictable. I still think it's worth doing, though, and you might end up finding kind of interesting patterns in the data regardless. So I don't think it'll be conclusive, but I think it's still important and interesting. I'm hoping that the tasks we use do predict real world behavior. Maybe they won't, but I think, it's valuable to do either way. It's something that we should be doing anyway, but it's just very hard to do, particularly with threats. Anyway.
Yeah. God, I keep forgetting what I wanted to say. Anyway, okay, then I actually wrote one thing down so I don't forget. And this is, okay. I wanted to ask her, this relates to the general question of how much this relates to your normal work. And that's so you said you're going to continue collecting data on this. But I'm also, is this something where you think this maybe adds like a new perspective to your own research, and that you do want to collect data, or you're almost waiting for some sort of event and you're like more on the lookout now for these kind of natural experiments, or
I mean, I think I would be more so than I ever have been before, because I've definitely learned that this is actually quite a effective way to validate things in the real world, and and it definitely has caused me to think more about how the work we do in the lab actually relates to real world threat perception. Because often it's like the kind of behaviors and responses we're looking at in the lab are so unrealistic. This is it's kind of gone hand in hand with a broader area of work that I've been doing with Dean, where we've been kind of thinking about how we can assess threat responses in more ecologically valid ways in the lab. So I've kind of been thinking about that in our lab, more lab-based work. How do we make things more ecologically valid? And then it's kind of gone hand in hand with the COVID work, where we're thinking about how does what we do in the lab actually reflect how people behave in the real world. I think specifically one thing that I have realized is that uncertainty in the real world is not very easy to kind of conceptualize. We have these neat kind of definitions of uncertainty that we use in our kind of models and our lab-based tasks that like all seem very, very neatly understood, and we kind of know what we're talking about. We know how to measure them. We know how to model them and everything. When you get to the real world, it almost seems like you're more uncertain about the type of uncertainty people are experiencing. Everything is a lot more complicated, and I've been thinking about ways to kind of measure that in the real world. Like, how do you measure how uncertain someone is about their threat from COVID? It's actually a very difficult question to ask people, because, like I said, it's difficult for us to conceptualize where the sources of uncertainty are in the first place. And secondly, like, people are not very good at reporting their uncertainty. It's difficult. I mean, that's on us as much as them. Like, we need to find better ways to understand how uncertain people are feeling. In the lab, this sort of thing is far more controlled, so it's far more easy to do. In the real world, if we want to look at how people are kind of perceiving this kind of uncertainty, I've realized through doing this that it's very difficult, and we need to figure out better ways to do it. So yeah, I think it's definitely helped me kind of think more about these things, and so maybe I'll be looking for opportunities in the future to do it again,
rather than offering solutions.
Yeah.
Or...
It's offered solutions in terms of, perhaps it allows us to validate things and things like that. But yeah, most science causes you more problems than it solves, right? The whole, every result you get raises more questions than it answers. So
that's a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah, this is done exactly the same. And I think it's also just maybe aware of, I think you kind of get like wrapped up in the lab basically, and you kind of your way of thinking of everything is about how things work in the lab. And you sometimes forget that the outside world actually exists, and that people aren't necessarily going to react in the same way as they do in the lab. And you kind of maybe to think about that a little bit more when you're doing these tasks that we want to do.
Yeah, you don't want to become a what's sort of like a lab behavior psychologist.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to spend years developing these neat tasks that work perfectly in the lab but don't have any relevance to the real world, which I think is quite an easy thing to do if you don't have things occasionally that make you kind of force you to think about how people actually react in reality.
Yep.
So, not to put a downer on everything we do, but
I mean, it is just I also feel like to some extent, if you have a task in which you can very precisely manipulate variables, I feel like it should have some sort of real life effect, right? I mean, at least that's the fundamental assumption, is that.
Exactly. Yeah. It is the fundamental assumption, but it's one we don't test. So
yeah, has it? Yeah. I think this paper from economics, which is this from 2004 or 5 or something, which is sort of something like, what do laboratory results tell us about the real world, or something like that.
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but it sounds like a very important paper.
I haven't either.
I'm vaguely afraid of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That might be why I've not read it yet.
I think like one thing that's quite salient for me is, so most of the work I do is more like in the field of computational psychiatry. So it's understanding how we learn and make decisions and how that might relate to mental health. And one thing that I've seen in my work, other people have seen in theirs, is that the way in which people learn about positive and negative events that happen to them is associated with symptoms of anxiety and depression. So it seems like people who are more kind of depressed, but more anxious in certain ways, tend to learn more about negative than positive outcomes. So
I think that is Christoph's paper.
Yeah, I think Christoph has that. I think I don't know whether he looked at it specifically in response to anxiety and depression, but there have been other people.
I think he did a thing with depressed patients. I think.
Oh, okay.
And anyway,
I need to look at his paper. But there've been a few studies showing this now. It's quite a neat kind of explanation of these symptoms, because it makes sense that if you're learning about
in my face. Okay, now I've got it.
Okay, great. This makes a lot of sense, because if you're learning about bad things more than good things, you're probably going to feel more anxious and more depressed. That makes sense. But what's kind of implicitly assumed there
that's
is
the
that
police siren you warned me of, right?
it is, yes. Let's let that go. I'll let that go. There's always police.
This has been a very disrupted response.
Yeah.
First the fly, then the police.
I might just start all over again.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just start again. So lots of studies have shown that people learn more from negative than positive outcomes if they are more anxious and depressed. And that makes sense, because if things that happen to you in your everyday life that are bad and that are good, if you're kind of paying more attention to the bad than the good, you're going to probably feel worse. You're going to feel more anxious and more depressed. But that kind of implicitly assumes that the way in which you learn about these things does kind of influence your mood by kind of biasing you to pay more attention to the bad things in your life than the good things. Like, that's a very clear assumption there. We've not been able to test that in the lab. All we've basically shown is that people who have this kind of bias in learning have these symptoms, but that critical link we can't really test very easily, because that's something you need to do in the real world. And so, despite the fact that as a fundamental assumption, we've never tested it. And so, this pandemic allows us to do that to some extent. That's what I'm hoping to be able to do with the data we have, to see whether the way in which we learn does influence how we learn about the threat of the pandemic, which is a real world threat. And if it doesn't, then that would be slightly concerning. But even if it doesn't, it's not a nice result to get, and maybe there will be issues around the controllability of the pandemic that could explain it. I think it would be important, because it's something we really do need to think about if we want to, in a more clinical sense, if we want to translate these kind of results to helping people who suffer from mental health problems. So yeah, whether the outcome of this research is good or bad, it'll be important, I hope.
Yeah, it just occurred to me when you talked about your research, or this kind of research. You said earlier that you're not an expert in mental health or anything like that, and that's why you didn't include it. But from what you just said, it sounds like you're doing stuff that's at least pretty adjacent.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have been more clear on that. I wouldn't say... I mean, my PhD was in a mental health related field, so I know a fair bit about it. But I'm not clinically trained. And also, it's not really... In terms of the kind of more epidemiological aspect of it, just kind of producing sort of more descriptive information about how people's mental health is affected by the pandemic, and how various factors affect that. That's not my area of work at all. I'm more about the mechanisms that lead to those symptoms. So in that sense, it's not really my kind of area to focus on. So I'll leave that to the psychiatrists and the clinical psychologists.
Yeah, they've got to have something to do.
Yeah.
Otherwise they'll just get bored.
Yeah. I think like what hopefully will be nice is we end up with this kind of convergence of findings where there will be research out there showing that people's mental health has sadly deteriorated because of this. And then we'll have our more kind of mechanistic research showing that, perhaps it's the way in which people have learned about this threat has kind of perhaps had some impact upon that kind of deterioration of people's mental health. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff going on, but perhaps that will be something that comes out of it. And yeah, actually, as well, something on a slightly different topic, but something that this has made me acutely aware of is, in some sense, how unimportant our work is in the field of mental health research, because it may be that the way in which people are learning about their environment, about the good and bad stuff that happens to them, does play some role in how anxious or depressed or whatever they become. But there are a huge number of other factors going on right now in the world, such as their like actual risk, their, whether they've lost their job, things like that, people being thrown into poverty and things that are going to have a far bigger effect on some bias than some bias in their learning. I think it's also made me appreciative about that in my everyday work. Like, ultimately, I think what we're doing is important, but there are far bigger issues that could be addressed than what we're looking at.
But then again, isn't it just that in some sense the work you're doing is less obvious and less trivial? I mean, knowing that if you lose your job, most people feel bad about afterwards. It's kind of obvious.
Yeah, and I agree. It's definitely kind of less obvious, and there is always the fact that some people who don't lose their jobs will become depressed. There are people who lose their jobs and will be fine in terms of their mental health, and that's where what we do kind of is helpful. But I don't know. It's made me feel that it's more of a political issue, I guess. But if you think the amount of money that is poured into what we do as nice as it is, it keeps us in jobs, and I think it's important. There are more salient things that could be addressed that would have a bigger effect. So, I mean, like in the United States, for example, European countries have generally done a lot better at keeping people paid, whether that's through kind of, furlough schemes, things like that. Whereas in the US, they've not done that really at all. And in terms of people's mental health, that's it's not something we can help with in our work. That's something the government has to do, but it's arguably going to have a much bigger effect than anything we could ever do. And so, yeah, I guess it's more a political question of funding priorities. Is that something you want to invest in?
But then again, I mean, that's the whole thing with basic research, right? That you never know where it's going to lead. My favorite example of this is still that, to paint a very, very broad story here, to paint a story, yeah, whatever. Let's paint stories. In the 60s or 70s, John O'Keefe put an electrode in a rat, and now we're in this paper that came out a few years ago from Christian Döller's group, where they found that they can use grid cell-like activity in entorhinal cortex or they found differences between people who are likely to develop Alzheimer's and those who won't. Yeah, which seems to offer some sort of initial glimpse at how you might develop some sort of neuroimaging-based what's the term when you find out who will develop a disease? Prognostic or
prognostic biomarker.
So you start with something completely random in rats, and then you end up with something that might help people figure out who's going to develop Alzheimer's.
Yeah,
20 years before they have symptoms. So
yeah, I imagine we may not be quite the same, but we may have some similar effects that come out of the work that's happened during COVID, where we discover things that we didn't expect to discover. We come across interesting findings about how people perceive risk in the real world that then cause us to think differently about what we're doing in the lab, and who knows where that will lead us. So yeah, I think you can never, basic research is crucial, and you can never predict where it's going to go, what it's going to lead to, and I don't think it'll be any different with the work we're doing. I think it's more when you get to the applied stuff, I think that if anything, its importance almost diminishes. I don't know.
I mean, it seems to me it's just a matter of time frame, right? The immediate importance of what we do is zero, and the long-term 50-year down the road kind of thing, I think then evens out. Well, maybe not evens out, but slightly balances it out.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the hope.
Yeah,
that's what we tell ourselves.
We'll never know, but yes.
Just imagine, like, after we retire and go, this was all so pointless. I wasted government money.
I mean, that's almost what I'm expecting, but that's like that. I mean, that's how science works, right? You fail a hell of a lot before you get anywhere. We know about the successes, but we always remember the failures. But the failures were just important because they showed us what didn't work.
Exactly.
And you also always get, it's because we're human, you always get the kind of like hype cycle in research where new methods come about, we get massively excited about them. There are examples, fMRI is one, genetics to some extent has been another, and people think it's going to save the world, and we're going to learn everything, we're going to cure psychiatric, neurological disorders, whatever, and then it turns out that's not true. And you might kind of perceive that as, we failed, things didn't work out as we hoped, we wasted loads of money, but that's kind of part of the process of discovering the truth. So,
but then again,
it's
I
just
think,
how things work.
Isn't it? I don't know how true this is in general, but I feel like a lot of the examples I've heard of actual breakthroughs in science happened after some methodological development. So it was the case. I mean, using John O'Keefe, I think he was just one of the early people to use this electrode system where mice could run around. That was,
Yeah.
So in some sense, I think there's always a hype cycle, but I think there's some truth to it.
I agree. It's often the case that I think that sometimes these like new methods that come about are perceived to have failed more than they actually have, because you're right, like they will inevitably lead to discoveries that could not have been made without them. They'll also probably lead to a load of rubbish, but it's like you kind of have to try everything, right? See what works, and some of those things will be really important. Some of them won't
exactly.
be.
I was about to say that the importance of the one discovery you might get from it might be like make everything else basically irrelevant.
Yeah. I mean, with fMRI, like a lot of stuff that's been done with it is either just false positives or not particularly informative or anything, but there are some really interesting things. I mean, like on the in the sense of grid cells, Tim Berrin's work showing that abstract relational concepts seem to be encoded by some sort of grid cell like system. Like that's something that was achieved with fMRI that I think is really important. And you wouldn't have got that without fMRI, even if you did get all the rubbish that came out of fMRI as well.
So the hope is just that maybe we'll be one of the non-rubbish things.
Hopefully, you never know. But I mean, inevitably, I think most of what both of us produce will probably be towards the rubbish side. I think that's the same with most scientists. Even like the greatest scientists, I imagine, have done a lot of stuff that they would consider to be rubbish, like 20, 30 years down the line. You may believe it at the time, but you always learn things later on where you're like, oh, actually, maybe what I did before, in light of what I know now, was not quite so good. And I mean, that's just how things work. It's just kind of...
I mean, the best example to me is then that... So I played the piano a lot, especially in my teenage years. There's a lot of music by very great composers that's really not that great. And where you really want to, like, this is the same person that did all this other great stuff. Like, sure. So, yeah.
Yeah. And like... No one out there is going to be a genius 100% of the time, right? You're going to get things wrong. You're going to do things badly. As much as we want to try and stop ourselves from doing that, but it happens. And partly, a lot of it is just that you don't know what you were doing is wrong at the time, because I mean, like, so and again, fMRI is a good example of that. A lot of early work in fMRI was using statistical methods that were questionable at best, but I don't think they knew that at the time.
You would do it, right, if you knew it was shit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then people started to realize actually maybe we should be a bit more careful about these things because of all these reasons. I mean,
let's be honest, most of the stuff we're doing right now is terrible in retrospect, right?
Yeah,
because there'll be some completely different way of analyzing MRI, and then
exactly. And I mean, it doesn't mean we haven't learned anything, and it just means that not everything is going to be perfect. There will be some interesting results that come out of it. There'll be enough that comes out of it to move the field forward, but we can't expect everything we do to be absolutely perfect in hindsight.
Not everything.
Yeah. Not everything. we can hope.
Like 90%, but not everything.
Yeah. But I think also, I mean, we're like, in that sense, there are still things we could do better, that we can try and preempt those concerns more than we perhaps do. So one thing that I think happened with fMRI is that people didn't necessarily consider what they were doing as much as they should have done. It's, you know, this really exciting method. You just kind of run with it and do everything you can without really thinking about whether what you're doing is right. So like in the field of computational psychiatry, for example, I think we may end up having similar concerns because maybe hopefully not quite as bad, but and I think I'm guilty of this as much as anyone is. But you know, we should probably be doing more kind of validation on the methods we're using. I mean, it's partly what I'm trying to do with the COVID stuff, but in terms of like the statistical methods we're using, so I had a conference paper that's been just accepted with Vincent Volton and Ollie Robinson from UCL, where we've looked at what's the best way to fit hierarchical Bayesian models to data when you have multiple patient populations, and the way in which you do that affects your false positive rate. And that's something that we hadn't really, no one had really considered before. So we're trying to we are trying to get in there and address those things like now, but rather than, you know, it being 10, 15 years time, when everyone's done these studies and suddenly we realize that we've done them all wrong. So I think, yeah, we need to be kind of proactive in that. There will always be the case that we'll learn things and stuff we did before we'll realize was not right, but we do need to be kind of proactive and trying to do the best we can, I guess, as well. Sorry, I've just waffled forever about random.
No, I think the last quarter of an hour has been a very good therapy session. or both of us convincing ourselves that it's fine that we fail a lot.
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah. I guess, how long have you been doing your PhD for?
Almost 2 years now. Although, okay. You know, I mean, I started January last year, and it's now early November. And then again, it does feel like I'm, you know, the last half year I've been spent more on the COVID research than on my actual PhD research. So in a sense, it feels like I've been doing my PhD for 1.5 years at most. But
yeah,
I've been here almost 2 years now.
Okay, all right. You've not yet reached the stage where you've realised that everything you've done before is wrong.
Wait, what?
Not everything, but
I'll just cut that part out and just pretend you never said that. No. I mean, it's kind of interesting because we did like one study, and then the one I mentioned earlier, where I still just have to finish the code, and there, the interesting thing is this: I had like one idea and tested it in a specific context, and there the question was, how much does this generalize to other contexts, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing is, it generalized really well. So I've always been in the other way. I was like, we did the second like pilot for something that would then come later. I was like, wow, this looks better than the initial results.
That's brilliant.
This is amazing. Yeah, it seems like we looked at for some reason, we almost looked at one of the harder contexts to find the effect. I mean, this is still based on preliminary pilot, but yeah. So in the moment, I'm still in the other opposite direction. That I feel like I'm getting better. We'll see how long it lasts. But.
Oh my god, I don't think it's ever happened to me. But,
yeah, I mean,
but I think
this is with a pilot, right? It's not. It's a.
I guess
it's a somewhat decent pilot. It's not like a tiny thing.
I mean, I've certainly had pilots that didn't end up working out when I did the real thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it could still all come crumbling.
Yeah, yeah. But I think I mean, I know I feel this way, and other people do, where you always end up being feeling very critical of your prior work, even if it's not entirely justified. But because you'd always do it differently if you did it again. You'd always know there are things you could have done better.
Quite a few.
Yeah. So if it was not a complete failure, like you would do it better a second time round. You probably do it better if you did it a third time round. Like it's not a bad thing that what we did before it could have been improved. It just means that we've learned something. The methods we're using have improved. That happens, and I'm sure you'll reach a stage where you look back on the study and think, God, what was I thinking? I could have, I should have done this completely differently. But,
yeah. I mean, I do have those thoughts in general quite a lot. It's like, is this really good enough? But then again, I think there is also quite a utility in just starting. I mean, as with almost the COVID research, as we said, like if you wait and theorize forever, you'll never do anything. So you just have to do something, and then you realize the error, and then you correct.
Yeah, I definitely tend to go through things in more of a trial and error way than I think some people do, which might not be good. But I don't know. I'd like to just kind of get stuck in and try stuff and see if it works.
Worked pretty alright so far, right? For you.
Yeah, I mean, like I've had multiple things that have not worked though as well. So, because I mean, the number of like things I've like rough kind of things I've piloted and haven't worked has been too much. But
by the way, have you ever made a failure CV? If you've heard,
I did it. Yeah, I did actually do it a while ago. I've not updated it though. I probably should do because
I found that so helpful for like because then it was suddenly as soon as something didn't fail, it's like I'm building my CV. It actually felt like I was achieving something. Yeah,
no, because I mean then like sadly like it's a numbers game, right? Like everything we do basically is down to it's the result of a weighted random number generator. So you just need to try as many things as possible, and adding things to your failure CV means that you've been trying more things. I mean, like I've done pretty much entire studies that just didn't work, and like also I've done studies that like didn't work for like stupid reasons as well. Like not that I tested the hypothesis well and I didn't find the effect. Just that I realized I did the study really poorly, and so I got inconclusive results. And it's like you can't really publish it because it's just like it wasn't done very well. But that's
the most frustrating. I had that with one of my master's theses where we ran it. It seemed basically all the control checks, everything worked. It's just we didn't have the power to detect the effect.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily that it was basically with using MEG decoding within person. So it's not. It seems like maybe adding huge amounts of trials per person would have helped, but probably not. It seems like there might actually be just some sort of limit to, but the thing is not even necessarily, as going back to your point, not necessarily even in a particularly interesting way. It just seems to have not worked, but not because you made a huge error. It just doesn't really work, and that's just so frustrating because you have this thing, and it feels like maybe we should publish this. It's like. Because it's kind of useful, but then it's so much effort to just show that something didn't quite work.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I also had an MEG decoding study that didn't work. Okay. So I had one that did work, which will be coming out soon. But that was basically a response to the first one, which like I kind of realized eventually. I was like, I did the study as I really wanted to kind of cling on to it and do something with it, but. The more I did, the more I realized that like if I tried to write it up, I was just trying to like explain away all the things that didn't work because the experimental design was not good enough. Like I should have designed it completely differently. It's like things are inconclusive because I don't know. I was maybe like expecting to find stuff in conditions where, in hindsight, I designed the experiment in a way that it would never produce those effects. Like it was, it's that sort of annoying thing.
Have you learned some sort of way or procedure to avoid that kind of stuff in your future current research?
Yes, be more careful. Don't rush into things. I think sometimes I have definitely kind of rushed into running studies without thinking things through as much as I should have done kind of theoretically. And I mean, I think that was one example of that. And so what I've tried to do more nowadays is do more kind of like simulation based work beforehand, make sure I have some kind of formal model of what I'm expecting that I can use to simulate data. And, you can then you get a better idea of whether it should work, before you try it out. I think I would have had less failure if I had done that before. Obviously that, you may be simulating data from an incorrect model or whatever. It's not bound to work, but, I think that would have been helpful. But also it is often tempting, I think, just to as much as I'm a fan of just kind of like trying things out and seeing whether they work, sometimes you get a bit too excited about something and don't necessarily stop to evaluate whether it's working before you just kind of run with it.
The simulation thing is actually the one thing that I guess I'm at the stage where I've noticed that I should be doing that, but I haven't actually done it yet for the next projects. But I definitely plan for the next projects to, just simulate exactly what the results I more or less expect, and then what tests I would do and all this kind of stuff. Because it seems to me that it's so easy to think you know exactly what you're doing until you actually sit down to do it, and then
absolutely.
I realize I had a very vague idea of what I was going to do.
And pre-registration helps with that as well, right? Like when you have to sit down and formalize your hypotheses. I think sometimes when things haven't gone so well, I mean, I've pre-registered stuff that has not worked as well, but but it does definitely help you think a bit more about whether what you're doing is sensible, as well.
Yeah, and like what exact results you're expecting and how you test them.
Yeah. And I mean, like I have a study that I'm doing right now where I was kind of I'm testing this basic kind of behavioral effect that I think should exist, but I realized that I don't know whether this kind of it's basically a decision-making paradigm. I don't know whether using this kind of planning mechanism that I'm hypothesizing people would use is actually going to be helpful. Because, in certain tasks, you may expect people to make decisions in a particular way, but if it doesn't benefit them to do so, then why would they? So there's, I don't know, the two-step task that was developed by Nathaniel Dorr.
Yes, but I need a reminder. I've definitely heard it a lot.
It's I can't explain it because it's confusing, but essentially it allows you to look at this distinction between sort of goal-directed or model-based behavior and habitual versus habitual.
Is it the thing where you have to choose between two options, and then depending on which one you choose, there's different probabilities for two things happening?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the idea is that it allows you to determine how much someone's behavior is influenced by this model-based planning system versus a model-free planning system, the goal-directed versus the habitual. But in the original version of the task, it doesn't pay to be more goal-directed or more model-based. So in that sense, if you see that someone isn't doing that, then actually they're being perfectly sensible. They're using this kind of less computationally expensive decision-making method. They're doing just as well. And then that kind of affects how you interpret results from that task in psychiatric populations, for example. There's some nice work by Wooter-Kuhl who kind of developed a task where they kind of incentivize goal-directed behavior.
So is he the guy who does effort-based stuff or something around that?
I think so, yeah.
I've never really read his stuff, but I've seen his name a bit, yeah.
But yeah, he has this incentivized version of the two-step task, which they then use in psychiatric population, or to look at relationships with psychiatric symptoms and things. And then you see that there are effects of how much you incentivize this thing. Anyway, long story short, with that task, I feel like the original authors maybe should have checked whether it's actually beneficial for the subject to use the strategy they're expecting to see. And I've had that same thing in my own task. I design this task and actually, wait, is it worth people doing this? Or is it? Thankfully, it turns out it is. But through using simulations, I'll be able to kind of verify that it actually helps people to do that. Because that's the sort of thing where if I then did that and did not find the expected effect, it may have just been that there was no reason for people to do what I wanted them to.
And then you get this huge data set, or not huge, but a substantial data set on people doing exactly what you'd expect, but not what you want. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So I definitely think simulation is a helpful way to do these things. But then I don't know. It's not always going to work.
Yeah, but I think it's just about increasing the probability of it working, right? It's not about
and it depends what kind of work you're doing as well. I couldn't have done that with the COVID stuff. This is more helpful for kind of lab-based stuff where you have a formal model.
That's one thing that I've really noticed is that there's just different types of doing research, right? The more exploratory kind of, going out into the woods and seeing what you'll find. And then the more theory-driven create a specific experiment and analysis plan to test that, and I've realized I'm really not that good at the first, and it's not. I really don't like doing it, and I don't think I'll do it a lot more in the future. Maybe on a small scale, like with small questions you have, but like not with like large data sets, because that whole thing is not for me.
I agree.
So I think what you just outlined is probably more correct for the second type, right? Where you have a clear hypothesis and what you expect. And
yes, yeah, definitely. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've been talking for quite a while now.
Yes, we have.
I'm not sure.
Is there anything more? Any more specific stuff that you need to get covered?
Let's see. I had a few. Well, in theory, I wanted to talk about how our studies fit together. I think that was initially how I contacted you.
I think we did cover that a little bit, yeah. I think
very slightly, I think. Yeah.
We can...
Actually, I mean, so this is now completely unstructured, but there's one question I had about how the studies fit together, and that's what I found. And this is actually, have you looked at further data than those that week from the longitudinal stuff, or...
Yes.
Okay, because one thing that's striking to me is the difference in terms of risk perception, in that I've got you. So you have this increase between week 1 and week 2, basically, or time point 1, time point 2, where especially for self, it jumps from like 40% to 50%.
Yes.
And thereby, because it increases also for other people, but less so. And because of that, you get this reduction in optimism bias, right? Or comparative optimism, yeah. So we don't have that at all. We have this completely different. Okay. So I said we looked at, we collected data on, I think so I think we might have collected our first data on the last day that you collected data for this.
Okay.
So I think that's how I think that's how they relate temporally. But then we found there's a reduction in overall perception for everyone, and thereby comparative optimism doesn't change at all across any of our we have 3 optimism questions: getting infected, infecting others, and getting severe symptoms that require hospitalization.
Yeah.
And across none of those we find any change in optimism bias at all.
Interesting.
You could of course argue that the relative shift changes, right? If you go from 40-60 to 20-40, then that is a difference. But if we right now we're just subtracting them, that's what we use as the comparative optimism score. So just the subtraction doesn't change at all. It just reduces from time point 1 to 3. Not like perfectly linear, but it seems almost the exact opposite of what you found, right? Like we find the reduction in in these probabilities, and then no change in optimism.
So you found that people became, their perceived risk became lower?
Yeah, quite a bit.
That's interesting. And was that across every country?
Haven't looked into that, I don't think.
Because it might be that where like Europe was hit a bit earlier than the US.
Yeah, so we did have, most of our participants in this 430 people are from Europe. The US citizens are fairly few. We had a annoyingly low retention rate for the Americans.
Okay.
We had a pretty good one for the Germans, were very German and just completed the survey again as asked. It was very stereotypical. And the Americans just started and stopped, and then we didn't invite them.
But now for you to do longitudinal research in Germany.
I mean, we had at least 2/3 retention rate from each time point, and we didn't tell people about that this was a long-term thing. We just asked them again, and 2/3 did it again. Whereas in the US, we went from something like 250 people to 90 or something over the 3 years.
Ours wasn't amazing either.
Yeah, but with the Germans from 200 to 130 or something was pretty good. Anyway, so I haven't really looked at the differences between countries there. But as I said, most of the stuff I've seen has been pretty stable across countries, so my guess would be that it didn't change.
In our sample, we did actually see then a decrease in perceived risk from like starting like the beginning of April to mid-April. So it was basically like kind of mid-March or sort of early March. It's kind of at lowest. It kind of peaked towards sort of late March, and then by mid-April it had gone down quite substantially as well. So it may just be that you kind of got to that
a bit earlier.
Possibly.
Yeah, I mean, so the second in our case was 1st of April, and we already had a decrease there from 16th to 1st, 16th of March to 1st of April. That might
so I guess
a little bit.
Yeah.
There,
If they were kind of 2 weeks ahead, maybe, then that would match up with our pattern in the US. Also, it was kind of like it went up to a peak and then sort of plateaued for like two weeks or something. Was it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I can't remember. Before going down again. It definitely kind of changed over time. It sort of increased, stopped for a bit, then went down.
Okay, it seems
and then went back up again.
And so that's the like general probabilities, but the differences.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah. That's not the differences.
Exactly,
that's just the overall. Yeah.
But do you also have something where ours are just so stable. It's the curves. So I have these curves for time point 1, 2, and 3 for each. So we have 3 optimism questions, and they look identical almost.
So ours look. They have. I'm just looking at the data now. They have a broadly similar pattern. The only difference is that, for example, as things go towards, because we follow people up. I mean, we followed up until yesterday actually.
Okay.
But I don't have the latest data. But like going to the summer, for example, people's ratings of other people's likelihood of getting infection kind of went up, whereas their own stayed quite low. I think that's largely because many of our
I guess it did go up.
Respondents. Yeah, so cases in a lot of the US did go up quite highly in the summer, but some states they didn't. So in states in particular on the East Coast, where we have quite a lot of people from, so that's just probably because people are kind of realistically thinking the average person in the United States has a higher likelihood than I do. Maybe not the average person, but like someone else in the United States. It's hard to tell how they actually.
Yeah, I mean, we also found, so like one thing I try to look at is really to what extent, I mean, basically where this risk perception comes from. And there are a few very obvious candidate things for the different questions. And it seems like pretty much people are aware of these things as far as we can tell. So it seems all pretty, I mean, whether the bias is in that sense then rational, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems overall that the probabilities seem to, I mean, some of these things are very obvious, like the older you are, the more likely you are to get severe symptoms, that kind of thing. That's all in the data. So it seems that people are being pretty sensible about this in terms of what was known at the time.
Yeah. The other thing is that we don't know. It's hard to tell kind of how representative the people you're sampling are in terms of their actual risk. It may just be that people who tend to do these things are genuinely at lower risk than the average person, possibly.
We had this one huge, what was it? Talking about finding errors. There was this one thing where I thought the Germans were just so different. And I think it turned out I just coded a column incorrectly or something. And then I was like, oh, no, they're not. It's fine. I just messed this up. But there was this one where I was like, oh, this is really fascinating. Like, why are the Germans so different? Actually, no, it wasn't actually fascinating. It was this questions the quality of our data. It was more that. It's like, I'm not sure this. Because the Germans, I was like, are they really that? I think it was, so we asked them how much contact they usually have. And the Germans just reported very low, like just super low. And I thought, because the German population on Prolific isn't super huge. So I thought maybe they advertised in like some specific thing that they didn't realize was very specific to socially isolated people or something. But then it turns out I just included a very stupid extra column or something, very like something random in the way the data was collected. So then I was asking for a binary variable, whether they're married or something. Like it's completely random. And then it turns out everyone said, or like a lot of people said no or something. Okay. Not married, but like just something like that.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I mean, it was good to know that like talking about the length of the survey and people taking part in these surveys and how well they do it. It seems that like data's consistent over the stuff that should be consistent. Pretty
Yeah.
much. It makes sense what people said, the variables relative to each other.
Yeah.
I mean, at a group level, there are always outliers, but at a group level, it seems kind of good to, there are some of those tests you don't want to do. It's like,
I know.
How much is the age going to differ or something between people with examples? But they all came out pretty well.
Yeah, same with us. Yeah, it's reassuring.
And then the other question I had was, so did you only look about optimism for getting infected or also for other stuff?
No, we only looked at it for the risk of getting infected. I think we had a question about severity of infection perhaps as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember.
It
was a long time since I did this now, but it was it's mainly around the likelihood of getting infected. Yeah, we probably should have done it for other things as well, but
I mean, because we in theory had 3/4 questions in there. One was the getting infected, the other was infecting someone else, and then the third was severity of symptoms. And we kind of had that in two ways: getting severe symptoms or getting mild symptoms. But then during the pandemic, it turned out a lot of people were asymptomatic, so I was no longer sure that mild symptoms was a good thing. So we kind of dropped that one because it seemed like, it's a kind of a mediocre to good kind of thing. So anyway, we kept with hospitalization is definitely bad. And what's kind of interesting there is that there's just this quite a difference between those questions, in that there's actually no optimism for getting severe symptoms.
Okay. Interesting.
And there's more optimism for like this, the strength of optimism is more for infecting others than for getting infected yourself. And so what's kind of interesting, and it is this three things. So infect others is more than get infected is more than severe symptoms.
That's interesting.
And the kind of thing that is interesting that is like right now still a kind of guess in there is that there's a kind of perceived level of control there.
Yeah.
So you can't really affect what your symptoms are going to be because it largely depends on your immune system once you're infected.
Yeah.
And
true.
You can kind of affect how much you're going to get infected because you can minimize stuff, but you can't. You have to go shopping and someone might just not wear a mask and cough at you, right? There's the stuff you can't control. But infecting others is probably the thing you can control the most, in the sense that you can wear a mask and stay at home, that kind of thing. And I don't know, that's kind of something that we didn't expect at all. Something we didn't plan for.
That's really interesting.
That's kind of in there, but I guess you don't have any data really to compare that.
No, we don't. Sense, No, as another thing that we should have done better, I think. But
I mean, this wasn't planned.
Well, we should have accidentally done better. Yeah, we just focus on the likelihood and kind of ignore the rest. But I
mean, part of this actually
like
came up when someone contacted me, again, talking about the cool thing about preprints. Someone contacted me saying, hey, did you look at this comparison? I mean, I would have done it probably, but I just hadn't done it at the time because she said that they didn't find this in their sample. I think they were. I don't know whether they were looking for it and didn't find it, but at least they made that comparison and didn't find it at all.
Yeah.
And we found it. Yeah, but we did.
Interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, but then again, it's also like, not quite sure what to do with it.
I don't know. At this point, you just kind of put it out there and see what people make of it.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
I wish I could try and replicate it, but sadly I can't.
Well, you can always collect more data if you want to.
Yeah.
That's very... oh, wait, actually, you were also contacted by the replication thing, right?
Yeah. Were you as well?
Yeah. Not me.
Oh,
but
really?
I mean, like, we were contacted, Christoph was contacted for our project, which makes... When I think you tweeted about it, and then...
Yeah.
And my first thought, well, it's looking less random now.
Yeah.
Because I said that.
Okay, that's weird.
Selected stuff randomly, right?
Yeah. Okay, I don't... That's interesting.
I mean, our assumption was that it was about... because there was this criticism towards research being done quickly during the pandemic. That
essentially, so they got in touch with us once they'd sort of formalized their replication plan. I don't know what's been become of it.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything either. Once we gave them our questionnaire, basically.
Okay. Yeah, they like gave us the protocol. We could comment on it and stuff, and it seemed like they were doing a really good job of it, and they were going to add in some extra things that were quite interesting to test as well. So I'm quite looking forward to seeing the results. I mean, I highly doubt that our result would replicate because it was in this fairly unique window of time, which you just can't.
What do they want to replicate of yours? Because
for us, they wanted to replicate our finding that people's engagement in social distancing and hand washing were predicted mostly by their perceived personal risk, rather than their kind of risk of infecting others or anything.
Okay.
So, like,
so I was just laughing because yours is a very specific one, and then ours was just optimism bias.
Oh, really?
Which is almost
okay.
Which is a pretty it's not controversial to find optimism bias.
Yeah.
It's a pretty standard thing. So when we heard that they wanted to replicate and that they want to replicate that finding in particular, we thought like, well, yeah, they are. They will.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That will always come
several
up.
samples. It always came up. We have like several replications in our own data set.
Oh. Okay, that's a lot nicer than ours then. Yeah. No, I highly doubt. I mean, I doubt. I have no confidence that it would replicate now. I mean, partly because sorry. So again, the way
they want to predict that the how much they wash their hands.
So hand washing and social distancing.
Okay, that's predicted by personal
perceived personal risk. Yeah.
We can look at that too, and we want to, but I don't think that's the part of the analysis I haven't done yet. The longitudinal thing.
I mean, if you can, it'd be great. It'd be cool to see.
I mean, that's basically what I'll be doing tomorrow, I think.
Okay.
Running that analysis. Yeah.
I think. I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether it replicates. I don't know if it will because, the ways in which we now know that, hand washing isn't quite as, maybe it's important it's important, but it's not like quite as critical as we felt maybe it was back in March. The ways in which people are socially distancing, and that back then, nowhere in the United States was it mandatory, for example. Whereas now it's kind of out of your control to some extent. Like there are so many factors that I think that relationship right now would be completely different. But I mean that's partly what I think makes our results particularly interesting.
Yeah.
Yours as well. It's that very unique window of time when people were just being hit with this thing, and there was relatively little government involvement, at least in the United States. So our own kind of psychological responses had a greater impact on our behavior, I guess.
Yeah, I think you also had the advantage maybe that because you were earlier, you might not have had some of the ceiling effects we have, because a lot of people. Well, it was kind of interesting. So we asked this one question: how much did you reduce your physical contacts, whatever exactly the phrasing was? And pretty much everyone said they did it. I mean, it really was a thing that where 100 was the most, was selected by, I don't know, like 90% of people or something. Or something like that. It was a kind of thing that was so skewed that basically everyone said they did it. But then we also asked so we have this question, like how many physical contacts do you have with this, like separated for different social contacts, per week, usually. And then during Corona, and then you did find that most people reduced quite a lot, but obviously not to zero. So that's kind of the measure we're using now as social reduction.
That's cool.
Of course, it's still, the problem is still reported once the pandemic started, which is still problematic. And it's, I mean, as all of this, it's self-reported anyway. Okay, I'll have a look and see whether we can. I mean, that's one of the interesting things. Yeah. But it is the weird thing about replications, where it can seem like, it seems to me always you'll get this label of whether your study replicated or not.
Yeah, I know.
And then, so like just based on that, you'll probably come off looking way worse than we will. Which is fine by me.
I mean, also like this very fine line between what's a replication and what is I forgot what the other word is, but some kind of like extension basically. And so I wouldn't consider this a replication because the claim we're making was that in the first week of the pandemic, this is what happened. So without repeating the first week of the pandemic, you can't entirely replicate it. I still think it's interesting and worth doing, but I wouldn't class it as in the strictest sense of replication. But who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. But I mean, I think it is cool that they're doing it, right? And they must have huge amounts of. I don't know where the resources come from if they want to replicate all sorts of studies.
I don't know, but
yeah, it is. I mean, I think when I saw your tweet, I coincidentally a week or two before found this thing by. I mean, this is completely different research about scarcity and how that affects cognitive performance and all sorts of things. And they were that was part of that replication effort in Nature and Science, where they had like social science in Nature and Science. That was probably from 2010 to 2016 or something. And so the scarcity paper was one of those papers, and that didn't replicate. And the authors were kind of a bit annoyed with the replication because they said like, I mean, the replication people said we're replicating the first study because that's the most important thing. And they said, well, for us, the first study was more like the thing to get the ball rolling and the actual mechanisms follow later. So then what I thought was really cool, they then actually, so this is by, I think the first author is Shah, S-H-A-H or something. Anyway, it's about scarcity. And they then actually did their own replication effort of all the other stuff they did. And they also, they found then, I mean, not everything, but like the study, right? And they found that, so they just replicated their own study, and they found that the one that didn't replicate, they also couldn't replicate, but all the others they could. So it seems like this one, but then again, it leads to this thing you see, like, you read this Nature Human Behavior paper, I think it was, that says, oh, these people didn't replicate. And it just looks like,
Yeah,
it's difficult to do these things.
I know. Yeah, and I've seen lots of disagreements where, the original authors don't think that it's being replicated entirely properly and stuff. And I don't know. It's good when they have this kind of like, they allow the authors and the replications to go back and forth and kind of
I mean, we didn't have that much back and forth though. I think for us, it was more, they said, hey, we want to do this replication and, I think basically asked for the methods, and we just like wrote them all of our questions in a Word document and sent them to them, and we basically haven't heard from them. It's been
so we got through like a full kind of protocol document, like they
or maybe
edit
Christoph
and
did, but I think
I think I went to
there
me.
there wasn't that much.
Okay.
There was a few times when Christoph was like, I haven't heard anything from them. I'm assuming.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe
but, I mean, they've got a huge thing to do also.
Yeah.
Just organizationally.
Yeah. Yep. So we'll see what comes of it.
I think I'll be
I should probably go and eat lunch at some point.